Thanks, everybody. We're going to get kicked off with our March 13th meeting of the UP Energy Task Force. Thank you, everybody, for flexibility and understanding that we're going to be participating in a variety of ways. So we've got a location here in Lansing, and we have some folks here with us. It sounds like the great place to be today is in Escanaba because there are more task force members and more public up there. So thanks for everybody assembling and for being flexible. So I think before we get started, what would be really helpful is if we just went around and understood who all was in the room in Escanaba, who's all from a task force perspective in the room here in Lansing, and then we'll go around the phone line as well. So if I can ask first, for those of you in Escanaba, if we've got my co-chair, Mike Prusi, maybe he can take us around the room up there.
I'm here, Director Clark, and we have a pretty good representation. I think Chris Swartz is the only one I see that hasn't arrived yet. And I believe we have can you hear me? Is my mic on?
You sound great. We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, okay. Well, then I'll make sure the mic stays on. And Aaron Johnson, Director Ajiba's designee, has joined us today for his first meeting as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Kimber, can you, is there any possibility you can tip the camera back down on the computer? Because we could see you guys, like not super well, but at least we could see the room. Okay, thanks. And then could we just go around and all the task force members say their names so that so we know everybody who's in the room in Escanaba, and then we'll do the same thing here and on the phone.
Aaron Johnson, Region Engineer for Michigan Department of Transportation and Director Ajiba's designee.
Vice Chair Mike Prusi, private citizen.
Tony Ratajski, I'm with the Upper Peninsula Construction Council. Michael Larson, Michigan Energy Options.
Jen Hill, Citizen Utility Board.
Tanya Sweenor, Superior Watershed Partnership.
David Camps, Blue Terra owner.
Mike Formansky, City of Escanaba. Chris Bowman, Bowman Gas.
Well, I see Roman is on the screen. Are you on the mic as well, Dr. Sidortsov?
I absolutely am, and thank you for pronouncing my last name. I know it's not easy to do. Yes, Roman Sidortsov, Michigan Tech.
Great. Let's continue around the phone. Who else do we have on the phone?
This is Dan Scripps, Michigan Public Service Commission.
And Tanya Kozlowski with the Michigan Electric and Gas Association is on. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Travis Warner with the Public Service Commission is also on.
Great. Thanks, Travis. Do we have Mike Nystrom? Okay. I thought he was calling in, and then I'm trying to look at our acronyms. Who else do we have on the phone line? Or our initials? You see Kimber?
You have Ethan Kramer on the line as well.
Oh, great. Thanks, Ethan. Okay, that's everybody on the line. Okay, and this is Liesl here in the room.
Douglas Chester, Electric Energy.
And then that's it from a task force member perspective. I'll let you know that you might hear a lot from James today because you could perhaps guess that I'm getting pulled in a lot of different directions at the moment. So I'm going to do my best to be here and be with you and be present when I'm with you. But just know that I might need to be handing things off from time to time. So first off, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And again, being flexible as we were also trying to make sure that we were able to do the business of the task force, but in a little bit more. Great. Thank you for recording us, Kimber. I'd like to just start off by doing some of the general task force business. And we have revised the agenda, which you should all have in front of you. Not necessarily have in front of you. So let me talk through what we anticipate doing today. So we had set aside some time at the front to make sure that we were getting all of our communications pieces to work, and then we'll do some general task force business, our minutes work, etc. And then I'd like to talk about kind of the timeline that we're operating under at the forefront. And then we've invited public sector consultants here to talk through the task force report work that they all have done. So we'll hand it over to Eric and Jill for about half an hour to walk through that document that you have received as well. Then we will open it up for public comments. And then we'll see how quickly we're moving. At that point, we will either break for lunch or move into a discussion of the draft report and draft recommendations. So the crux of what we'd really like to do today is make sure that we have received verbal feedback from all of you on the task force recommendations. We would like to get to a point where we have a draft that you all have given input on that can then be posted for public comment. That is our hope by the end of the day today. I will say that we are always happy to be iterative, as I hope we've been all along. So don't assume that you have to say it today in order for it all to happen, but let's try to get as much on the table today as possible, particularly big direction. And I don't know that we're going to need to be assembled until 4:30. I think we've received a lot of feedback from folks already about where the recommendations are going, and it's generally been that while we may have smaller discussions, the general thrust has been correct. So hopefully, because of our frequent and regular communication, we've captured what you all are thinking. So with that, I'm going to just take a break for a second, see if there's questions on the agenda, and then we'll adopt the agenda for today. Okay, hearing no questions. And I can't see you guys real well, Mike, so I'm going to let you interrupt me or kind of be the guide to make sure that we're, between the two of us, hearing from all the task force members.
Looks like we're all
so
pretty
first,
copacetic.
Great. So first I'd like to move the agenda for today.
Madam Chair, Tony Ratajski, I'll make a motion that we accept today's agenda.
Thanks, Tony. Do I have a second?
This is Douglas Chester, I second.
Okay. I guess technically any other comments on the agenda? Okay. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, great. The agenda's been adopted. I don't have minutes in front of me. Do we have any minutes to adopt?
We do have February 7 minutes. The members here have them. They may not have made it to the members there.
Okay.
I have them as well.
Let's. Oh, okay, thank you. All right, well then let's go ahead and adopt them unless anyone's got concerns. So do I have a motion to move the minutes from February 7th?
So moved.
This is Dan Scripps, so moved.
Support.
Thank you. Support, great. So let's open it up. Were there any comments on the minutes from the 7th? Okay, great. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, thanks everybody. So we've moved and adopted the agenda and the minutes from the February 7th meeting. So with that, I'm gonna probably talk about, go ahead. Is there anybody? Oh, hey, how are you? We've been joined by Mike Nystrom. Can you sit by Douglas, because we're trying to congregate in the middle of the table. Sure. And we've thoroughly wiped down all of your, no, I'm just kidding. We just adopted the agenda and the minutes from February 7th. Okay. So what I'd like to do now, before I turn it over to our friends from public sector to talk through the document that they have shared with us, I do want to talk at a high level about the outline for draft recommendations. So there was a version that you all saw on March 10th. And then that is what we're talking about here today. So on the 13th, so we want to talk through draft recommendations. We need feedback. We've received, some already. We want to have a group dialogue about that and then see if there's other comments. And please continue to share suggested edits and changes. We'll do that together today, but also, as I mentioned, iterative and happy to keep doing that. We'd like to get to a point where we understand and are agreed to kind of the broad thrust of the recommendations, and we'll see how well we can work through that here today. That would, of course, be our goal by the end of the day. Then the intent would be the week of March 16th, we open the public comment period, and we would ask to all of you, to help us publicize that. We'll also, of course, be publicizing that. So the draft recommendations will incorporate all of your recommendations and suggestions and edits that will be posted to the UP Energy Task Force website, and then we'll publicize it through all of our means. And then we also have, continue to have that email box available to receive comments. So that would then be open until April 6th, which will be the last day of public comment period. And then we'll do it on a rolling basis, but we'll also, at that point, summarize and share the public comment with you. But we'll, kind of keep it rolling throughout that period as well. Public comments would then be incorporated for consideration from the 7th to the 13th. And then we would have a meeting on April 13th is what we're recommending in case there are big things that we need to make sure that we've talked through and incorporated from public comment. Then we would draft the final recommendation, or the final recommendations will be completed, and it would be submitted with the technical report to the governor's office on April 17th. Right. So you have two documents in front of you. One are the task force recommendations, and then the other is the public sector consultant document. So what we're asking for comments on is on the recommendations themselves. Okay. I know that I ran through that really quickly, and I'm going to talk about it again at the end of the session, but are there any just general questions about the process in front of us as it exists right now? Mike, you got anything up there?
I don't see anybody at the table raising their hand.
Excellent. Anybody on the phone? Okay, thanks. I'm going to just kind of ask and check in with you all because I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to give input, and this can be a little awkward from time to time, so I want to make sure I'm checking with you. Okay, so we are going to move to the next agenda item, which is to have a presentation from public sector consultants about the reports that they've prepared. And so with that, you should have a copy of the analysis of propane study alternatives for Michigan. That is lengthy. Well done, Eric. And I'm going to hand it over now to Eric Pardini and Jill from Public Sector Consultants.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, folks.
Awesome. And Kimber, are you able to share the slides that we had that just sort of at a high level have some of the tables from the report, nothing different from the report itself that the task force members have been distributed, but just for ease of reference, I've got a few just called out results that we want to discuss.
Yeah, Eric, could you get closer to your microphone or up the volume somehow? Not everybody can hear what you're saying.
So green is good.
Green is good.
Any better if I lean in?
Not really.
Okay, so these must not be working. Why don't we'll try this one first, and then we might need Jim back. Try that one, see if I'm wondering if it's the same, right?
Is this any better?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Oh, great.
Okay.
All right.
On the screen here, can you see them there too?
We can't see them.
We're still seeing the recommendations, Kimber.
Whoa, hey, Dan.
Somebody's bought it, Dan.
Dan's got to share his breakfast.
Oh,
Thank you.
fantastic.
Nice work.
Thanks again, everybody, for being flexible and patient. This is great.
Yep, great.
Carry on, Eric.
All right, so I'll just say advance or next slide whenever, so you can advance it. So let's this is just an analysis. This is just a summary discussion from the analysis that we framed up for folks at the February meeting. We presented the preliminary results at that point. Since that time, we've made a lot more definitive conclusions on both the assumptions in the analysis and outcomes and some of the cost impacts. So we'll be walking through those and available for any questions you have. The report, as Liesl said, is lengthy. You'll see it's sort of oriented in a sort of three parts. The first really frames up the baseline of what Michigan's current propane supplies look like, how dependent we are on outside sources, what sources those are, what does our consumption profile look like. And then we go into sort of the discussion of the modeling itself, framing up what we did, what we were able to do with available data, and then the final part is the summary of results and conclusions. So today, since you've already heard from us around how we framed up this study and some of that baseline information, we're going to just jump into the results and then obviously be available for whatever questions they have. So next slide, please.
Are you getting the next slide?
No.
Neither are we.
Oh, no.
You got it.
It went away. There we go.
There we go.
Great. All right. So this is just to reiterate the objectives that we set out when we took on this project. So one, model the current propane supply system for Michigan. So understanding where we're dependent on, how big the different supply resources are as far as the contribution to Michigan's total needs, and then to identify alternative approaches to meeting Michigan propane supply. So as we described, we looked outside of Michigan, and across North America to identify the major sources for propane that we could rely on. Part of that analysis involved finding places that we could find reasonable pricing data for. So we will explain that there are some options that do not get explicitly modeled due to lack of availability for the spot prices out of the data sets we were able to
it's not.
find.
And he's talking too fast to make.
Yeah, we can't hear you very well, and the slide is sharing with you, but not here.
It's like I'm getting every fifth word. Like,
So I think if you go ahead and talk through the slides, but maybe take your time knowing that they're not able to receive the visual input at the same time.
Perfect. All right, so we're still on slide 2, talking about Michigan propane study objectives, and this just outlines sort of the two main points that we were emphasizing.
Yeah, you're quiet again, Eric. I don't know if your mic is turned down or.
Why don't you come over here and talk into this? Because obviously this is, yep, obviously this is working. Sorry, we're readjusting.
Yes.
Kimber, for what it's worth, I can see the slides.
You guys can see the slide?
I can see
Yes.
it, yeah.
Can you just
I can
email
too.
us the damn?
Okay, we can't see it here. I don't know why.
We'll have Roman share them.
We all have, half of us have.
Well, lucky we.
Can Roman share them with us?
Yep, he could, if Roman has them.
Eric, is it possible to email the slides to? I might be able to share my screen easier than Kimber trying to run the AV as well.
Yeah, I think, I had, Michael helping me with it too, and it just isn't, it's not connecting with our screen here, so I'm wondering if the size of it is affecting my computer somehow.
All right. Yes. All right. Is it any better volume? I'm talking directly into the polyphone now.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, the volume works. We're having some issues with sharing the screen, and I think you guys were gone for a minute. Can you send me the file? I might be able to have more success sharing my screen than.
Yep. Jill will email it to you right now.
Thank you.
And then Eric's gonna talk slowly
Yes.
and make the points, that are on the slide and just talk us through it.
Yeah. So at this point, we're still in that slide 2, which Jill will share, and all that shows is the bullets for our modeling objectives as were presented in our presentation at the St. Ignace meeting. So the two main priorities for the modeling exercise were to develop understanding of the current supply system as it relates to serving Michigan's propane needs, that we could then take some of our inputs and assumptions and make modifications under the consideration of the supply disruptions that we were considering for the work. The second piece of that was to identify the alternatives that are available to meeting Michigan's propane needs. And that entailed identifying the major sources of propane across North America, and then the supply routes that we could access that propane through. So that investigation led us to examination of existing pipeline infrastructure serving from propane supply sources, rail infrastructure and existing rail routes, and then the availability of trucking as a delivery point.
Are there any questions there? Okay.
Great. So the next slide just reiterates the scenarios evaluated. So we had a discussion with the task force, I believe in January, where we landed on 3 different scenarios to look at as they relate to Michigan's propane supply. The first scenario was to evaluate the extent and impact of a disruption of Enbridge's Line 1, shipping from Alberta to Superior, Wisconsin. The second scenario we looked at was to evaluate a supply disruption of Enbridge Line 5, so the line running from Superior to Sarnia. What you see from those 2 scenarios is they are interdependent systems, so they have relatively similar impacts, but we'll discuss those when we get to the scenarios themselves. The final scenario was looking at how weather could impact on the demand side and the supply side in the state. So the first question within that scenario was, what would happen if weather experienced abnormally low temperatures, and is that different across the state in different regions of the state? And the second part was, what's the potential pricing impact, considering that weather would likely be a regional event? So judging from past experience to be able to say how much more of an impact could it be if it were widespread, say, as the 2013-2014 polar vortex. So I'm going to pause there and see if Dan, have you got the slides be able to pull up, because then we get into tables and charts.
Yep, I'm opening it now. I think that I've got, give me,
We're good to go on this end. Our slides are on the screen here in Escanaba, or Bark River Harris.
in that,
Excellent.
if that's true, then I don't know that I need to do mine.
But are you stuck on slide 2, Kimber?
Yeah, we're stuck for the moment.
Okay,
Yes,
Yeah.
Dan, if you do have a scenario that,
all right. I have requested control from whoever's running.
exact.
So I think you can control, Dan.
I just did, and I think now I have it. Okay,
Yeah. It's,
Sorry.
Starting on page, 60.
share. Can folks see that?
Yep. If
Now,
don't-
can you see the chart?
Yep.
Yep. Can you make it, can you do the,
Yep.
yeah, that thing? Okay.
Perfect. Is everyone good with that?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Works up here.
Great.
Excellent.
All right,
Good
we're
down here.
on the same slide now. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to show was for all of the scenarios evaluated, we used the same basic supply or demand curve for Michigan. So this is based off of historical demand for both the Lower Peninsula and Upper Peninsula, to which we evaluated, how, was there sort of a levelization that we could do based on average heating degree days, so the amount of cold days in the winter. And so using, analyzing sort of the past 10 years of data, we applied this factor to levelize it, and we came up with a demand curve that looks like this, where you have total demand in Michigan is 500 million gallons per year. Of that, 465 comes from the Lower Peninsula, and 35 million comes from the Upper Peninsula. And so you can see that represented in this chart, where you have this sort of major increase starting in sort of September, October throughout the heating season, and then starting to decline after a peak month of January, but still with relatively high demand in January and February. Average consumption per month in Michigan ends up being about 40 million gallons a year. And then you've got a peak month consumption of up to 75 million gallons a year in the January timeframe. So what this does is it allows us to look at sort of the distributed impacts of propane supply impacts across different scenarios, depending on time of year when they're experienced. An outage in June and July looks a lot different on the immediate needs of Michigan customers than, say, in the January, February time horizon. Next slide, please.
All right, I'm trying. All right. Is that the next one? Okay.
Yep, perfect. So these are the results from our analysis of for scenario 1, outage of line 1. So what we did was we assumed that the propane production coming out of Rapid River, which is supplied by line 5, and a portion of propane production coming out of Superior, Wisconsin, that's served by line 1, is our primary supply sources to the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. We note in our report that there is a challenge with designating exactly which gallons of propane serve the state because of the limited tracking, at least at a public level, of where propane gallons go once they're produced if they don't cross a PAD district. So PAD 2 is quite large, so you can get propane pretty far without crossing that boundary. And also, or the other way is to understand if there's international imports which are tracked. So in the case of looking at production from Ontario facilities in Sarnia, we are able to see a direct link as far as there's pipelines that cross from Sarnia into Southeast Michigan supplying propane, which are tracked on a monthly and annual basis. So we can report out the exact amount of propane that comes back into Michigan from Sarnia. But focusing on the Upper Peninsula, we chose to assume that all of the production from Rapid River is consumed within the Upper Peninsula, amounting to over 30 million gallons per year. and up to 87% or up to 87.6% of the Upper Peninsula's propane demand could be serviced from that facility. And then from Superior, Wisconsin, we have a harder time making a firm assessment of how much production comes from Superior to Michigan. However, we know that based on location, Superior is in proximity to several counties in the western Upper Peninsula, and for some of those communities could be seen as the same distance or difference in time transportation than Rapid River. So we assume that a portion of Michigan's propane supply comes from there. We allocated that at 6.2% of the Upper Peninsula supply, less than 0.5% of the total statewide supply at 2 million gallons. So assuming that those two facilities are supplying the quantities of propane we've provided, and that in the event of a line 1 disruption, you lose both the product served to Rapid River and Superior, you could have a total impact on Michigan supplies of 93.8% for the Upper Peninsula. And then secondarily, if you look at the Ontario facilities production, which are served from line 1 and line 5 ultimately, we look at the production value coming from Superior or from Ontario as up to 42.9% of Michigan's total supply. The total end consumption or end supply impact that we've modeled for scenario 1 is over 200 million gallons, 232 million gallons, and we put that number at 46.5% of supply. So I'll pause there for any questions.
Yeah, we have a question here.
Hey, Eric. At the meeting in St. Ignace, there was a note that said there was an estimate of 1/3 to half being from Rapid River. I'm wondering how that fits into this set of numbers.
So not looking at that directly, I believe the note was referring to 1/3 to 1/2 of all of Michigan's supply, and that was meaning from dependent on line 5, not necessarily Rapid River independently. So Rapid River, based on actual withdrawals of NGL and the production expected from that level of feedstock, the most we've been able to put that production value at is about 30 million gallons a year. So that would be, it's a fraction of statewide supply, but a large portion if we assume that it's only consumed in the Upper Peninsula.
Some probably goes to Wisconsin, but.
Yeah, and there are lots of things where we put into the full report to caveat that, there's likely Rapid River is sending to Wisconsin, likely Michigan customers are driving south of the bridge, or Michigan retailers are driving south of the bridge pulling gallons, but for sort of reasonableness and expectations in this, we've allocated that full amount to the Upper Peninsula. So I would say, Jen, to your question, the closer amount for that range as we were presenting it was we had estimates at that time of as low as 30% to up to 50% of Michigan supply dependent on line 5 resources. We're saying that this is our view, a better estimate, putting it at 46.5 of total statewide resources from a line 1 outage.
Thank you.
Any other questions on these impact numbers?
And no duration here, right?
So this is on an so this is just a point in time for an annual basis. There is the expectation that we could extrapolate this to sort of a monthly number, depending on if there were sort of specific things that we could predict, or if we were, but if you weren't able to predict any of those things, you could. These production outputs from these facilities are pretty constant because they're supplied by pipeline. So it's reasonable to say that you could take this to a monthly production figure, and that could be the monthly impact.
Yeah, but going back to a slide ago, we all know that propane use fluctuates.
Yep.
So obviously, depending on, if you're in June or if you're in December, you've got a very different outlook.
Yeah, and so the way the model is built, and part of the original proposal design was that we transfer that to, I believe, Public Service Commission staff, and there's a training session to be able to allow them to use it. So the more granular questions that happen, if there's other considerations that come out of the UP Energy Task Force approach could pull on the model to look at sort of specific instances that we may not have considered in our
Certainly.
scenario development.
That makes sense.
Great.
Other questions on scenario one?
The only, this is Jen again, when we did the tour at Rapid River, my understanding was that the facility does basically quiet down or in the summertime. It might need to be a caveat. It's not that there's average annual production there. It does ramp up and ramp down, was my understanding from the tour.
Yes. Yeah, and Jen, that's correct from the data we reviewed. So you do see that, and it generally follows Michigan's propane consumption curve. So you have that variability. This is levelizing those production levels across the year. So we had a 2-year average of deliveries to Rapid River that we used to build this assumption. But yeah, in that data, you can see the variability. This assumes, one, that you're producing at the level of deliveries on an average basis from 2 years, but within months, yes, they do have the ability to ramp up. I think in the report, we talk about the overall capacity for these 3 facilities being much higher than the assumed production and utilization rate for facilities. So Rapid River is, I want to say, 7,500. Don't quote me on that. I know that Superior, Wisconsin is 10,000. Sarnia is over 100,000. I think Rapid River's rated capacity is 7,500. The most that we saw them producing the most we saw them withdrawing in a 2-year period was about 6,000. So using a good portion of their overall capacity, but again, that average number was about producing about 2,000 gallons or 2,000 gallons a day.
Eric, this is Roman, if I may. So
Yes,
I do recall this this note about the overall capacity versus the actual production in your report. Perhaps it makes sense to note that moment, that sort of to say that the output throughout the year varies, and and maybe even give the general trend when a facility is operating at a full capacity and when it's not.
Yeah, so the limitation with that, I'm happy to put a note that calls that out for Rapid River. The limitation is we don't have that similar level of information for either Superior or Sarnia. The volumes transported to those facilities were on an annualized basis, and you'll see in here that we have notes about sort of data availability at the producer level. So that's why the annualized figure for the rest of the facilities. But yeah, on the Rapid River side, it is much easier to look at that availability on a monthly basis. So we can make a note of that.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions on the scenario 1? Great. All right. Next slide, please, Dan. All right, so scenario 2, it'll look a lot similar to the scenario 1. Because line 1 transports NGLs that are subsequently transported on line 5, the only real difference in those numbers is whatever's extracted at Superior, Wisconsin. So roughly 80,000 barrels a day is transported across line 1, and then the transport capacity on line 5 is is 7,600 or so. These numbers are a little bit, we've rounded here for the sake of discussion, but so essentially only 4,000 gallons are withdrawn at Superior. The rest is transported to Rapid River and subsequently Sarnia. So these numbers don't vary tremendously. However, we do separate out the production value from the Superior, Wisconsin facility in this analysis. So you see a slight reduction in the impact both in the Upper Peninsula and an even smaller proportional impact over on a statewide basis, with the numbers for the Lower Peninsula remaining the same. This just, I think, illustrates that line 1 and line 5 are very dependent. Enbridge's Lakehead system doesn't have other NGL supply routes as it's currently configured. So line 5 is basically dependent on the line 1 operating volume, but we did want to consider how those, whether or not a line 1 would be drastically different. And in our analysis, they do not show major differences. Again, that depends on the amount of product that can be expected out of the Superior, Wisconsin facility, but this is our estimate for it. So putting the total statewide impact of scenario 2 at 230 million gallons.
Hey, Eric.
Yes, go ahead.
When we were up in Hancock and the Enbridge guys there making their presentation, I believe they said that if line 5 went down, it would take down the fractionator at Superior because they'd have nowhere to, take off the propane and send the heavier stuff down the line because there's no line to send it down.
Yeah, so we chased down that statement. Either Plains or Enbridge, I think, said that. And we were not able to get interaction from Plains specifically related to the operation of the Superior facility. Enbridge said that they'd have to make that decision about the ability to run line 5 or the ability to run anything to line 1 continuously if line 5 is out of operation. The reason we found this a viable scenario to evaluate was conversation with one of the pipeline engineers who had worked with the state on a previous study, said that there is the potential to batch smaller numbers of NGL, so it wouldn't be the same throughput that you would see currently as it looks to supply line 5. But if you were still trying to move crude oil through the line 1 system and then move that crude through the other elements of the Lakehead system, he said it was possible that you could batch smaller quantities of NGL, and that likely you would make that decision based on, that would be a decision based on, reconfiguring line 1, and there'd be some cost-benefit analysis that went into it, but it likely wouldn't completely interrupt the operation of that pipeline as it's configured now. So we assume that, yes, there have been statements made about that pipeline's continued operation for NGL transport, but we decided it was viable that you could potentially continue to ship the quantities to Superior. Any other questions on scenario 2?
Can I try that? So you're saying that if line 5 shut down, your analysis shows that they could change how much they send through the system, and they would still keep Superior fractionator open.
That is a potential. That is a potential that we found worth considering. At least in one part, just to isolate the portion of line 5 that's serving propane production that serves Michigan. Again, that decision will get made in a variety of ways as they look to evaluate the viability of that option, and we couldn't state for certainty that it wouldn't happen or that it would, although again the public statements have been that they would likely not keep that line operating for NGLs. One of the concerns is that there are only NGL volumes propane is only a portion of NGLs that are shipped on the line. There are other products that are left after you've fractionated the propane, and currently those are re-injected into line 5 for transport to petrochemical and other processing facilities further on down the line. So there would also need to be consideration of what you do with that existing product. But for this purpose, we wanted to evaluate the with and without difference.
Which is
Thank you.
very small. Yeah, they'll shut it down.
Are there any other questions on scenario 2?
We're cool here.
Great. All right, next slide, scenario 3. Thank you. So in scenario 3, this is where we wanted to take a look at the consumption impacts related to weather that's outside of the normalized values that we assigned for the initial chart that you saw. So heating degree days are that measure of cold weather. They are tracked at a regional level in Michigan. So there's 10 regions, so we're able to see the differences from the Western UP, Eastern UP, and across the state. So what we did with that information was looking back at historical experience in what the end of polar vortex of 2013, 2014 sort of serving as a benchmark in this case. We assumed that if you had a 20% increase in the number of heating degree days per region of the state in a given year, that you would see an increase of 10% of annual propane consumption in Michigan during that year. As you can see from this chart, a lot of that impact happens in the winter season, where you would typically expect it with cold weather. And you see impact to both Michigan, to the Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula. However, the impact for the Upper Peninsula tends to be higher, and resulting in an increase of propane demand of 22%. So the UP already has much higher incidence of heating degree days on a normal year.
Yeah, sorry, without it being the extreme weather event?
Yes,
Okay.
without a extreme weather event, the Western and Eastern UP are, I forget the exact percentage, but we show this in the full report. There's a chart that shows sort of the Upper Peninsula, and then lower, or central, northern, lower, and then central and southern. You can see there are demonstrable differences between the regions of the state, just with how cold, and anyone who's been in the UP kind of gets that.
Yep, that makes sense.
So a 22% increase in propane demand in the Upper Peninsula is a result of our extreme weather scenario. So this scenario was first evaluated independently to see if it's just a weather disruption, what are the impacts on consumption, and what would the potential price impacts be associated with needing to procure additional propane supplies. And then the second piece was we also used this as sort of a framing for analysis of the other two scenarios in our sensitivity analysis to say, how much worse could it be under a supply disruption if you also were experiencing extreme weather where you had an increased demand on the system? Any questions on scenario 3? Jill, is there anything you want to add about scenario 3?
No, it's just quite a bit peakier, that, as if that's an official term. We looked at various, and I think we're just about to get into this part of the discussion, ways of meeting that demand, could include purchasing just in time or purchasing during off-peak periods and putting supplies in storage in order to meet those that attenuated demand.
Yeah, and just to be clear for folks, then that shows up in the recommendations, which is what we'll flip to here in a couple minutes.
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you.
If there's any other questions on scenario 3, or else we can just describe the other sensitivities we analyzed, and then we'll get to the full discussion of results. Great. All right, so next slide, please. So as I spoke about a minute ago, one of the sensitivities we wanted to see was how does weather variability affect heating demand. So we know that a large portion of Michigan's propane demand is for space heating, which is seasonally variant and dependent in those the amount of heating degree days that are experienced during the heating season. What we see by using this analysis across the other scenarios is just a measurable impact of and sort of giving you a better range of, okay, in a normal year, we're able to count on this, and the impact of losing that supply would be X. But if it's the supply disruption plus extreme cold, then there's larger considerations to be had. We also add in here a consideration of what if temperatures are seasonally warmer. So I haven't looked at the full data set for the heating season in 2019 because it's not quite officially over, but I think early signs are that production has been lower in the, or consumption has been lower as a result of a relatively warmer winter. The other sensitivity we looked at was what happens to demand, and over time, can you, if you have energy efficiency programs, and over time, if you're able to reduce propane consumption up to 1.5%, And then scenario 3, what happens to the state's ability to be prepared for supply disruption if you have greater incidence of customer level storage, so entering the heating season. So our customers' tanks are, if you have more customers' tanks fuller before the heating season, are you more prepared in the event of a disruption?
Eric, this is Douglas. To make sure everybody understands, the energy efficiency reduction that you modeled is cumulative to when?
Yeah, and can you repeat that, because they might not be able to hear Douglas from the other side of the table?
Yeah, so Douglas's point was make sure that, can we speak to the cumulative impact of the energy efficiency sort of demand reduction over, and what period did we look at that over?
So we're really focusing our analysis on 1 year, so the impact is fairly modest, but make the point that over 10 years, energy efficiency impacts could grow. And that's probably some of the additional work we do with the Public Service Commission staff to utilize the model.
Again, we'll get into that more in part 2 of the report as we look at kind of cumulative impacts of a program like that.
Sure, but you present a sensitivity in the report labeled energy efficiency reduction, and I'm wanting clarity on how much energy efficiency is assumed in that scenario.
1.5%.
Just a single 1.5%.
1.5% for 1 year. And so then you can look at the overall impacts over time if you were to assume. And we use, because the 1.5% was established for natural gas, we use that as a baseline. And then we used associated program costs, assuming natural gas, to have a program cost associated with that.
Right. So the results would be a fair amount different if we were saying 5 years.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
And then you would also have to consider that the supply disruptions likely would have changed over that time. But yeah, so it's not a short-term resource, but it is part of the consideration, as James said, longer term.
The other thing is cumulative impact of energy efficiency will change sort of that weather-sensitive nature of propane demand. It will make us, it would make us a little less peaky.
We're all about flattening out the peak.
Flatten out the curve.
Flattening out the peak.
Because a lot of the energy efficiency reductions are around space heating savings through higher efficiency equipment or thermal envelope improvements, things like that. So
Great. Any other questions on, so I want to get to the modeling results and not use up too much more time. I know you've got a lot of discussion of recommendations. Any other questions on the sort of the framing of the scenarios?
I have a comment about sensitivity too. I think it's important not to muddle two different concepts, energy efficiency and energy conservation, because they mean different things. So here, we're talking about energy efficiency, so reduction in demand via energy efficiency measures, so which is not conservation, right? So I think that sticking to the terminology of energy efficiency is important. Conservation means you just use less. Doesn't matter how you use less.
Yeah, so I think the way we utilize this is that efficiency equals conservation, but not all conservation is efficiency.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All
But
right.
explaining this sort of, I think it's important to make sure that this is specifically about energy efficiency and not other conservation measures.
Great. Yep. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay. And I'm happy, as you have time to dig into the report, if there's any other comments that you want to send offline, we can coordinate those. Always willing to make this a better product.
Eric, I have plenty. I already have a
Great.
page.
We'll have, all right, perfect. We'll set up some time. All right, so moving on to modeling results. So we can go to slide 10. So 2 forward.
I think
Is it not
Over
showing
there.
up?
Perfect.
Yeah,
No,
over
it's
there.
perfect. Yeah, sorry. I looked at the screen. So what we did was we chose 5 different delivery points in Michigan to assume sort of the geographic dispensation of need, so that we could make sure that we're achieving the variable costs associated with delivering to different locations. So we're going to walk through the first the options for each supply point, and then get to the total portfolio cost associated with it. So I don't want to linger too long on the individual pieces, but I think a key thing to evaluate here is that what we did was we started with 3 hubs where we had available pricing data from Edmonton, from Conway, and from Mont Belvieu. These are the 3 largest sources, both of production and largely storage and processing capacity in the continent. Also the ones that we have pricing data for. The pricing data we used for this analysis was purchased from Oil Price Information Services, and it does not have other spot pricing for smaller facilities or for places outside of the sort of the southeast and Gulf Coast region, some on the West Coast, and then some of the major points within sort of the mid-continent area. So we didn't have pricing data for, say, Utica Marcellus, which would be the other closest term, but we do have conversation in the report that describes how that scenario could look. So for the priority supply options, we selected the top 4, the 4 lowest cost supply options from our modeling to include in the development of our portfolio approach. So what we see here is that the lowest cost option for delivery to Rapid River that we modeled was from Edmonton, Alberta to Escanaba, Michigan by rail, and then the resulting volumes moved to Rapid River for storage by truck. So the reason, in this case, Rapid River is the only facility that we chose that's a production and storage facility where that would be impacted by the supply disruptions that we modeled. And it's one that's not served by existing rail capacity. So you see that all of these options end up ultimately delivering to Rapid River by truck. And we have a conversation about potential impacts that we're not able to consider due to sort of the limitations of the data we had that could potentially increase the cost of each of these scenarios. But what we've done here in this table is lay out the supply options. So that's the delivery pathway, the acquisition pattern, which Jill will speak to. The commodity price is our modeling for what the price at the origin hub is. The transportation costs that to intermediate locations is, so if it's moved by pipeline to a point on that pipeline that has storage capacity, and then it needs to be subsequently moved to the end delivery point. So the first cost is either that pipeline, that rail, or that truck cost to the intermediate location. And then finally, the transport to the final location is the delivery from the intermediate supply location to Rapid River in this case. And then we also have some incremental storage costs assumed with needing to be able to meet the variability on a monthly basis of propane demand. And for a total cost, we provided sort of those four columns added up. In this scenario, our total impact of or the lowest cost option we found was this Edmonton to Escanaba to Rapid River route, which came in at 64.6 cents per gallon. We do provide a comparison to the spot price for Rapid River. In 2019, that spot price was lower than the previous 2 years and the 3-year average at about 60 cents per gallon. And so we see that it represents just over a 4-cent increase. I don't want to sort of fixate on that as being the low cost and option that's considered for all of the supply alternatives, because we quickly see as we look at building a portfolio approach, you're going to need likely more options for propane delivery than a single point is going to supply. And so if you look at the next 2 options they all come from Conway. First with delivery via pipeline to different intermediate storage points in the Midwest, and then ultimately delivered to Rapid River via truck. And you quickly see that the cost from the lowest cost option increase up to almost 20 cents per gallon, so 18 cents per gallon in these supply options. And that's where the next slide sort of shows that overall range. So this is just presenting the lowest 4 options, but the average of all the options we evaluated for this scenario, over 100 different ones, was $1.14. And then that compared to the average spot price from Rapid River, represents a marked increase for this delivery point.
So I just wanted to make the point that we select the 4 lowest price mutually exclusive options or non-mutually exclusive options. So within each delivery point, we looked at different acquisition patterns. So either just-in-time delivery, flat demand delivery, or what we're calling 2-to-1. Talking to rail providers, in some cases they specify a purchasing pattern or delivery pattern that would include 2 summer deliveries for every 1 winter period you have. We use those acquisition patterns to look at the impact on commodity price. So knowing that, what you're acquiring at the hub tends to cost less during the summer months. So your average commodity cost goes down when you look at flat demand, or that 2-to-1 when you're comparing to the just-in-time delivery pattern. We selected looked at various transportation options, including the capacity utilization for those capacity options. So with trucking, there are a number of fixed costs associated with that option. If you are running your trucks at 75 or 100% capacity, you see a lower cost per unit when we translate that to cost per gallon. We also look at the storage implications that come from our acquisition pattern and transportation patterns. If you're purchasing on a 2-to-1 basis, two summer deliveries for every 1 winter delivery, you need to have a considerable amount of storage in place in order to keep that propane that you are acquiring during summer months in advance of when that's going to be used. And so we've calculated how much storage you would need as you sort of build up your stores during the summer months and then begin to withdraw them during winter months when you're only getting a portion of the monthly demand delivered in any given month. So we have various permutations around different route options, and we pick the floor best and then the best of the options at that route.
Good question.
Yeah, I just have a question.
This was Jester. Sorry. Go ahead.
Mike, do you have one there?
I was just wondering, in your discussions with the rail companies and trucking companies, is there the capacity to move that amount of product into the Upper Peninsula, either with rail cars or large haulage semi-trucks?
Yeah, so both of those groups were provided limited input, not due to lack of trying on this report. So for the rail capacity, we were able to talk to a professor who studies the rail industry, especially as it relates to the Upper Peninsula, and he affirmed to us that the capacity exists to use the Class 1 rail within the Upper Peninsula. We do cite in the report some of the limitations of rail as an option. As far as trucking capacity goes, we assume that it's generally the last mile or last miles from the terminals where there's the trucking capacity. I think overall the sentiment was that the trucking industry continues to be constrained as far as the number of drivers to move volume, so that exists as a sort of a limitation here. And also the constraint exists that you can't use the largest trucks that are currently used in the state of Michigan for propane supply if you're looking at accessing out-of-state resources. So all of our trucking costs are modeled on a sub 10,000 gallon propane transport trailer versus the up to 15,000 gallon ones that are used in Michigan in some cases. So we did not assume that there would be availability in this index development of the portfolio options or availability challenges, but we do caveat where those availability challenges could potentially crop up and how that should be considered. But yes, this is just based on the roads, routes, and transport methods exist. and here is the reasonable assumption as to the cost of that. Again, there are so many other dynamics that would be at play if you do start to ship a significant quantity of propane in either transportation route, and that's true with pipelines too, if we're relying on other pipelines. But this is just as the current state is. Here are the costs associated with those transportation options.
All right, Douglas had one down here.
Yeah, actually, I've got 2 or 3 here. They're all relate to this table that we're showing now, the priority options for delivery to Rapid River. So first, a comment. I think it's a burden on the reader to try to compare these numbers to the existing system. And so my suggestion on that would be that we simply add a row to this table showing the current equivalent price, so that comparison is really straightforward. And then I want to check my understanding. The storage column in this table is the incremental costs of new storage because of the change in the delivery mechanism.
Right.
So the comparison of this would be to the delivered spot price at this facility now. There is some cost of that storage and some markup that happens after that, and that is presumed to stay the same basically.
For the year now, for the year analyzed, so 2019 data, yeah.
Okay. And I, in that regard, I think it would be helpful if somewhere it was clear how much incremental storage was involved in each of these scenarios. Just so if anybody's trying to think it through, they can see what you're telling us.
Sure.
So I think that's, and we do have a separate section of the report that describes the 3 storage levels. And so I think it's as simple as adding, this is the low case, this is the medium case, this is the high case for storage, because that's how these costs were assigned. I'm assuming, I think it's 1.5 up to 8 million gallons of storage that would need to be added.
Yeah, that'd be fine. It's just right now it's not crystal clear. My next question is specifically in modeling Rapid River, you've made the last leg by truck from whatever the delivery point is. On the first one here, where it's rail to Escanaba, I'm wondering, did you assess the costs of a rail extension to Rapid River as against the cost of using trucks for that last piece?
Yeah, so we didn't, because what we tried to avoid in the evaluation of alternatives were things where new infrastructure were needed to be invested. And so I think because those examples were explored in previous studies of, I think the dynamic risk talks about the cost in line extension of the rail line to Rapid River. We were looking at in sort of the instance of you have this outage is either unanticipated, we were talking about sort of long-term versus short-term. In the case of an unanticipated outage, you would not have that availability. So that's what this base case was built on. I think that this still serves as sort of a useful benchmark in decision-making of, yes, if you were able to plan for a potential outage, you would look at that cost scenario, and then those costs, I think, would be, but that would have to either be planned for or available in the long run. And so you could see that option crop up in here, but it was not something we considered as far as new infrastructure investment other than sort of the immediate storage and loading, unloading facilities needed at a location to accommodate the delivery volumes we're looking at.
So my next question, I think you've answered, but I just want to verify. Then you also did not assess the costs of, say, having a storage and transshipment facility next to the rail line.
So we did, that cost is in there. So the cost included in the transport price includes the delivery at origin and the end use site, as well as storage volume that sort of split across the two.
Yeah, but specifically, I mean, instead of going to Rapid River.
I think you could determine that by, and what the impact of that would be if you just back out the transport between the intermediate location, which is Escanaba to Rapid River. So that's a couple of pennies per gallon.
You wouldn't take more storage in Escanaba?
So you would have
to play out that scenario?
So you would, because we also assume the volumes of storage that are existing at Rapid River as part of the reason for continuing use of that, you would probably have to consider a different alternative that looks at, okay, do you need the storage investment that we considered as incremental plus some level of, other storage that was not considered because you assume Rapid River's operation and existing storage utilization. So yeah, you would probably have to evaluate that somewhat differently, but.
So in some sense, if we were looking for a long-term replacement of line 5, line 1, whatever, this would be subject to all the caveats in the report. It would be an overstatement in the sense that there could be alternatives that would be less expensive in the long run.
So we don't make a statement that there could be alternatives that would be less expensive. I think what we say is there could be alternatives that were not considered in the report. So one that we bring up is, like, would you add transport capacity to Utopia, and what would that look like, right? We don't explore that because that involves a whole other process of bidding out that additional capacity and having sort of a call for whether or not that capacity is needed for the region. We looked at the costs as they exist today and how we can feasibly look at supplying those alternatives. But yes, there would likely be other options that involve rail extension, new storage, terminal development, et cetera. So.
I do think, again, you could envision what some savings might be if you cited the incremental storage in Escanaba versus in Rapid River. So. Because when we're doing the analysis of the 2-to-1 acquisition pattern, we actually estimated what kind of peak storage would be, and that was about 13 million gallons. But then we looked at optimize, how we would use retail storage as well as end-use storage. To come up with that high case of 8 million gallons. And some of that would be capacity at Rapid River.
So I'm going to take oh no, that was really good. I'm going to take a second after that line of questioning just to do a time check too. So it's 11:20. We're going to continue to move through a presentation of this version of the report. Then we'll take public comment, hopefully break for lunch at noon, and then get into discussions of the draft recommendation. So just wanted to kind of give you all a feel for where we're at in the agenda and what we're going to do.
Okay,
so hopefully we can take public comment by about 20 to 12.
We have one more question, at least up here in the UP.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, Mike from Maskey here. Why is the storage cost different if they're all being stored in Rapid River?
So we assume that because of the delivery pattern, in some cases, you need incremental storage that's not currently at Rapid River. And so depending on the acquisition pattern, the storage level varies. And so to Douglas's point that we need to label the amount of storage that the storage cost or column is associated with. So the lower cost ends mean that you need lower storage, either associated with just-in-time delivery or flat deliveries month to month. And you see the higher storage costs potentially come up when you're looking at where you're bringing in volumes in the summer period versus in the winter period, because you do have price advantages at the commodity level by accessing propane during off-peak times.
And when you get to the last option, which has the lowest storage cost, but slightly higher cost for transport to the final location, you're, because of the distance involved there, you're able to use a lower capacity factor for your trucking costs, and you're playing that off against the storage costs. So you're trucking at a slightly lower capacity factor, but not needing as much storage in that case. And the end result is the low-cost option from that point.
And then another question. Eric, did you say trucks in Michigan are limited to 10,000 gallons, and they're not in other places?
No, I think it's 15,000 gallons, and there's a jumbo. It's a per axle limit that's used for these propane transport trucks, and so there's I think something like 15,000 gallon jumbo trucks, as they're called. This is something where those trucks are not allowed outside of, or to operate in most states outside of Michigan. I don't think any in the region. And so you can use them inside the state. So we assumed for this trucking cost that the trucks used would be less than 10,000 gallons. I think we used 8,800 as the transport truck volume. So that would fall below the threshold of the need to transport interstate.
I thought it was a Michigan issue, and we got an MDOT guy sitting here, we could lean on him, but never mind.
Yeah. I think everyone would like to know how we have such a specific trucking, a bit like a weight restriction versus the other states, but that is for a different time, I think.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
All right. So the next slide, and then we'll start going through these because the scenarios start to look a lot similar, and the the evaluation of the analysis isn't that different. But this is all the supply options we modeled. So you can see the top line is the average cost. So for Rapid River, you get roughly 60% of options below the average cost, but you can see there's several very high cost options that were considered. You'll notice that none of the priority options in here are coming from Mont Belvieu. That is true for all of the scenarios all of the delivery points we looked at. So there's really only one pipeline shipping propane out of Mont Belvieu, and that delivers sort of at the southern end of Illinois, Indiana into Ohio. And so you have additional transport distances there. To do by rail, you end up having additional transport distances, and Mont Belvieu is generally priced above Conway through the period of analysis. So it doesn't come up in any of the priority options. And so actually, in most cases, all of the Mont Belvieu price availability or price for alternatives was above the average in certain cases. So we also, in here for Douglas, we provide that benchmark to that Rapid River price. So that's the average for 3
Eric,
years.
I'm sorry, I do not understand. You're going to have to back up. Please explain what the $1.14 is and the 75 is. We can't see all of the X axis here because of some of the meeting information. So please start with
Dan,
labeling.
Can you move that toolbar at all? Dan, can you move that toolbar at all so we can see the definition of the x-axis?
And then please explain.
I don't think I have control over the toolbar.
Okay.
Please explain the numbers one more time. Thank you.
Go ahead. So the light blue bars on the screen that go sort of from the low end all the way to the high end of sort of $3 and some cents, those are the individual costs per supply alternative. So each one of those bars is a specific supply alternative that we modeled. The blue line at the top, that's labeled $1.14. That's the average cost associated with all the supply alternatives evaluated. And then the benchmark for measurement here is the yellow line, which is the average of 2017 through 2019 prices at Rapid River. As I mentioned earlier, the 2019 price for Rapid River was below this average at 60 cents. So if you can see a line on this chart at 60 cents, you see a lot fewer options that have prices below the Rapid River spot price. If you look at this benchmark of 3 years, you see that I think it's something like 90% of the options represent cost increases over that 3-year average, and a slightly higher percentage over that 2019 spot price observed.
Thank you.
Yep. Any questions on this visual? If we could advance the slide. So now as I said, for the 5 alternatives, we present the lowest cost options for each. So for Kinchlow, these options look very similar, with the addition of because Kinchlow is served directly by rail, it has the option of rail direct from Conway into the facility, which comes in at the second lowest cost.
You see the trucking cost options from intermediate terminals, both in sort of Indiana and in Wisconsin, being the next two priority options for the state, showing that, one, we lose out to the advantage that rail has for both price and volume being able to deliver, and you have slightly higher costs associated with the alternatives that are being shipped via truck, because trucking has higher variable costs associated with it. The further the distance those trucks have to go, the higher those prices end up. But you see here the option from Edmonton direct via rail coming at around 62 cents. And there's a 20-cent spread between Conway and Edmonton as far as rail delivery to Kinchlow, based on both the commodity price, but as well as the storage needed in those scenarios. So these are the 4 priority options as we evaluated for Kinchlow.
So you'll notice there's a block of, when you go to the next slide, there's a block of options that fall below that 75-cent line. Those are the different permutations of rail from Edmonton to Kinchlow, and we looked at the one that had the lowest cost. And then, as you cross that line, that's the next set of options.
One question. I think I understood from the report, from what you said, that in looking at, for example, Rapid River, and looking at what is possible there, you considered the available capacity for each of the options, and then it built up a blend that would deliver the total needed for Rapid River, correct? So in the event of a line 1 or line 5 disruption, several of these destination points would be affected. So did your analysis address the capacity to meet the combined demand from all of these destinations?
We did. So, and when we look at the total impact of scenario 1 or scenario 2, we've done some allocation of the shortage of the impact of the supply disruption across the Upper Peninsula and across the Lower Peninsula, based on current volumes, proximity to demand, and availability of storage. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so that's displayed when we get to the summary for the portfolios, the costs and volumes associated with each location delivery point, because those volumes delivered there depend on the demand in that proximity and the impacts. Okay. So because wanting to be sensitive of time, just briefly look at this slide with Kinchlow. Again, it's it's just the average cost of the portfolio options being slightly lower than Rapid River, predominantly because you have several low-cost rail options, but still you have a pretty wide display of options available. So next to Alto, so for all the Lower Peninsula options, you can still see rail having an advantage as far as its delivery goes. We see Edmonton to Alto being a rail option. Canadian National's lines out of Edmonton run both into the Upper Peninsula and into the Chicago market, and ultimately into Michigan. So identifiable pathways through those both of those directions. Similarly, Conway, Kansas via rail, and then options out of Conway via pipeline into Michigan with ultimate delivery via truck from 2 locations. This is the one where you see a permutation that involves rail to an intermediate terminal with trucking to an ultimate location being a feasible option, with Edmonton to Escanaba, then ultimately on to Alto for delivery. Partly, again, that comes up because of the commodity value for Edmonton being much lower than observed at Conway, and that's true both historically and in the 2019 period. However, we provide the discussion of all of the investments from Edmonton to move commodities to the West Coast and ultimate international export to higher price regions, which in the future could remove the discount that Edmonton has typically faced compared to Conway and Mont Belvieu in the U.S. Any discussion on Alto alternatives, and then we can address the last two.
Eric, I have a comment. I reviewed the report pretty thoroughly through, I think, page like 50 something, and then just went out of time. So I don't recall you guys specifically taking note of the shifting global pricing landscape. So, and if you do, yeah.
Go ahead. So I know that there's a full discussion of that in the conclusion section too, Roman, and I think it's briefly mentioned in the discussion of the of the overall shipments from Canada and how the increase in international exports are changing the dynamics there. But if you look at page 82 of the report, I think that's where we talk more about the increased push from Western Canada to move propane to different markets and potentially eroding the discount from Edmonton.
So, sounds good. It just, it occurs to me that both the presenter in Hancock and then the EIA expert, they both noted that this is what the trend is. And again, this is an item for, perhaps discussion of the entire task force, whether this particular aspect needs, a more emphasis in the report.
So what I think, what's key is that to de-emphasize the role Edmonton would play, we didn't select the low-cost option for the entire portfolio of Michigan, which is, so you'll see in the summary that we selected the top 3 options and then sort of a proportional share of supply being procured from all of those to develop the overall cost for each option. Because yes, that a consideration should be made that if this price discount erodes, you're looking at a different supply portfolio. But to minimize the reliance on that resource in our modeling, we decided to look at using several different options to build up the supply need for Michigan.
Sounds good.
So Roman, that's a good point. I think that you're not the only person I've heard, reiterate the fact that shift in international markets is something that needs to be kind of a common theme throughout not only the recommendations document, but also the report. I'm going to do a time check again and just say, I think, Eric, I don't know if we could do a summary and shift over to public comment and then figure out if we need to come back to anything after.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. All right. So I think you'll see as you review the report that the Marysville and Kalkaska delivery options, there is a common theme here that rail has a price discount in the transport space and that trucking has higher variable costs associated with it. So the further you're shipping via truck, the more costly options get. So overall, not a lot of differences between these different supply options as you go through them. So going to slide 20, I will talk about just the impacts of the scenarios after we built up the supplier approach. And you can see from here, this is where you'll see a breakdown of the base case impact, the sensitivity impacts that we evaluated to be able to have a further understanding of the overall cost impacts for the state. So these are in millions of dollars, these values, and in the report we break this down to show sort of on an annual basis. This would be the impact of a supply duration or of a supply disruption over that entire period. Using the portfolio approach, the average cost of this supply alternative would be at 74.5 cents per gallon. That's higher than both the 2019 spot prices at Rapid River and Sarnia, and would result in increased costs to Michigan consumers associated with these procurement strategies. The base case is not the lowest option, the lowest cost option.
Sorry, I'm gonna pause you for a second. Dan, can you put slide 20, is it 20?
Yeah.
Okay, put slide 20 up. Cause, Eric's looking at numbers on here.
Yep, so
Okay,
this just shows, and this is the same table that's provided for each scenario, and there's a subsequent table that's provided with the volumes associated with this. But this just shows the incremental cost of the scenarios to procure the propane required in these cases. And what we provided in the report is a discussion both of the range of these estimates based on the scenarios and sensitivities, as well as the total annual impact and then a per gallon impact of the scenarios. Because of the portfolio approach, you end up with about a 74.5 cent per gallon of propane, which is higher than both the 2019 Rapid River and Sarnia spot prices that we observed. You do see some reduction if you can institute in the year energy efficiency programs. So reducing the overall cost of propane procurement by up to $5 million. But again, that's a cumulative effect that can't be realized in the short term. Also to note, this is true throughout the scenarios, that weather has provides a pretty large swing in the pricing for the state. So if you were to have a supply disruption in the same time frame you had extreme weather, those costs quickly escalate, and you see $40 million, almost near $40 million a year increase in the cost of procurement. The supply costs don't vary that much for scenarios 1 and 2 because the volumes impacted are roughly the same. So it's a similar 74.6 cents, so slightly more costly on a per gallon basis, but overall that's the observable impact we've quantified for the supply disruptions. And on the weather scenario, all you really see is that incremental costs are higher under severe weather, as you would imagine. And if modeling a 50% increase in the prices as was observed in 2013, you can see that cost also escalate as the region struggles to meet the increased propane demand. So our report has several other high-level conclusions, but as far as the modeling results, these are the important points to emphasize. So you have a lot of options for propane delivery to the state. Not all of them are cost effective. And from the priority options we identified, you can see some options within range of the current options. However, to meet the expected impact of the scenarios we evaluated, you would have higher costs on the range of 74, not a cost increase, but costs around 75 cents per gallon of propane, which is higher than today's.
Eric, this might be a very elementary type question, but you say, and I probably should ask it before, it was rattling around in my noodle, but the wording severe weather, don't we see price increases every year with just basic winters? I mean, we're saying it as severe weather here, is my point. In my mind, we see price escalation just because it's winter.
We are considering that to a certain degree with the different acquisition patterns that we looked at. So if we're purchasing propane just in time, we are recognizing higher costs during winter months and lower costs during summer months. You see the lowest cost with the 2-to-1 acquisition pattern because you're buying, the 2/3 of your propane during the lowest cost period. So we are recognizing that in some of our analysis.
Yep. And then the potential increase, like on the high side, if you're looking at the experience of 2013, 2014 as the extreme end, wholesale prices increased 50% from 2013 to 2014 compared to the 2014, 2015 season. There's that variance. You see the sharp spike there. So looking at that, almost all of these options are the total overall cost impact of severe weather, if you're evaluating that other regional supply impact, would be 30% on top of these prices. And so, yeah, we do take that into effect in both accounts.
Well, I guess my point is we're saying severe. It's a sensitivity to weather, period, isn't it? It's not, so So I'm just saying for the report, maybe we don't need to have, maybe there's another word to use, but I don't know that we need to have severe, because severe leads me to believe that this pricing is the pricing of 2013 type events, not every year weather. I guess I'm not saying it the right way, but.
So it would be the impact of the weather being as severe as 2013 and 2014 on demand, but it's not and so we explain in here the associated price impact of, also that experience, but there's also a number of other factors in 2013, 2014 so this is assumed without other supply disruptions, where 2013 to 2014 had both a rail supply disruption and a pipeline supply disruption at the same time, so, yeah.
So, I'm sorry, I'm gonna, write your thoughts down, keep your questions. We need to shift over to public comment, because we're gonna lose some folks, in the Escanaba location who came specifically to get public comment. So what I'm gonna propose, and I can't see you guys up there, so, let me know, Mike, if heads are not nodding. But what I'm gonna propose is we shift over now to take public comment till lunch and hopefully get through everybody who wants to talk. And then when we come back from lunch, we can bring Eric and Jill back and walk through some questions and then move over to the recommendations. So heads are nodding down here. Is everybody okay with that up there?
Yes. Yeah, I don't see any objection, and we have 7 cards for public comment, so I will keep the time and we will begin forthwith if that's all right with you.
Great, thanks, Mike. And before I ask you to start the public comment up there, thank you, Roman, I am going to just remind everybody down here, if you want to give public comment, the cards are over there and you can fill them out. Okay, we don't have as many takers down here. So Mike, I'm going to give it to you, and I know that, with your qualifications as a former senator, you are well equipped to keep time for us.
I certainly am. And
Thank you.
Our first commenter will be Dr. Renee Richer from Gladstone. I won't start the time until she's actually ready to speak here.
Thank you. My name is Renee Richer from Escanaba Township, where UPCO is currently proposing an industrial solar project. I have a solar panel at my farm and business to offset the high costs of electricity provided by UPCO. My concern is that I currently cannot provide excess clean energy to the grid via net metering. UPCO, as a for-profit business, isn't serving the interests of customers. They claim to be pursuing renewable energy while limiting what Michiganders can provide to the grid. The result is that UPCO favors profits over ratepayers and renewable energy. We have been continuously misled in this community in regards to solar and distributed generation. Distributed generation and solar cooperatives would greatly benefit this community, the Upper Peninsula in general, and Michigan's overall solar production. Our communities would be best served by having the opportunity to have solar cooperatives and distributed generation. Michigan would also be best served in regards to renewable energy if there were no caps on net metering for solar production. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Richer. Our next commenter will be Kim Wyckoff.
Hello, I am Kim Wyckoff, and I have lived in Escanaba Township my whole life, minus the years I went to college. I live on the same parcel of land that I grew up on. Escanaba Township is a farming community, and our farms are multi-generational. As Renee said, they are looking at putting a solar array in our area, literally in our backyard. The topography of Escanaba Township and Flat Rock specifically is rolling farmland with very little soil on top of shale bedrock. The several areas, there is less than a 2 foot of soil filtration before getting to fractured shale bedrock. With the potential of the solar array, over 30,000 holes will be bored into our already fractured bedrock, creating the high potential of well water contamination. This is not a scare tactic. This is reality for many of my neighbors. We have recently had several of our wells contaminated. The state of Michigan, as well as our local government, they know the grave situation with our wells because our Escanaba Township applied for a grant to put in a water tower, and they were granted that grant. It was around $40,000, which is not even going to begin to cover the cost of putting in a water tower if our wells are contaminated with this solar array. They were looking at putting the solar array in at K.I. Sawyer. The residents there wanted it. It would not literally be in their backyard. It would not, the potential for well water contamination was not as great as it is in our area, and it would not affect the quality of life of their residents. We are asking that they look again at putting the solar array at K.I. Sawyer where it's wanted, not where it's not wanted. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Ada Knopf.
I'm Ada Knopf, also a resident of Escanaba Township. We have lived on our land for 56 years, and rightly so, because of the quality of life that we value. We value the country environment, our neighborhood, and our community, and we've invested very heavily financially, not only financially, but in sweat equity in our property and in our community. Now the industrial solar in our community is threatening our quality of life as well as our property values. We have viewed our property as a heritage for future generations, but who would want to buy land in an industrial solar community? There is no data yet as far as the devaluation of land, because so far in the UP, the only people that have purchased land where industrial solar, windmills, any alternative energy is going in is the people involved with the energy company, and they are purchasing land at the asking value or above. So at this point, we have no data to go back to as far as devaluing our land. We do not want our property devalued. Our property is for future generations. And once we lose something, you don't usually get it back. So we're asking that industrial solar not be allowed in our backyard, in our farming residential community. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Sheryl Shore, also from Gladstone.
Hello. I live in Escanaba Township, 4 miles from where I was born and raised. I left after graduation for 35 years for a career. I retired and I just moved back a few years ago. I bought a cute little house in the country, and I bought that house solely because it was across from a large field with dairy cows grazing, and I thought it was perfect. The land was zoned as agricultural under the PA 116 agreement, and I felt comfortable that I would probably be looking at that view for the rest of my life. Well, in June of last year, MDARD permitted utility-scale solar on land enrolled in the PA 116 under certain circumstances, and now we are faced with the possibility of a solar farm. If the proposed solar project is approved for Escanaba Township, I will be looking at thousands of solar panels for the rest of my life instead of cows. What a sad trade-off to the benefit of UPCO, for which we will see little to no benefit. They state that the project is expected to save UPCO's customers over $20 million in expected energy costs over the next 25 years. Well, if you do the math, it equates to a savings to us of approximately $15.38 a year. I am not against solar, but solar on this scale in our residential area is unacceptable. I believe there are more sensible areas to install it, and I would like OPCO to investigate those other areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Gene Sakeley from Marquette.
Hello, I am Jean Seckley from Marquette. I am here primarily because of Line 5 that has been taking advantage of Michigan for all these years and lies on the bottomlands that belong to all of us. I believe if there were a rupture of Line 5 in my future daughter-in-law's backyard in Superior, that if the line were disrupted, I'm not convinced Enbridge would repair it. It is an old line. Priorities change. Maybe they'll decide, well, the UP can get by. They don't really need us. I don't trust Enbridge as a large corporation working for other large corporations to guarantee that 300,000 people in the UP will have propane 5 years from now. They have investors, they have a board, their priorities can shift with the wind. The tar sand fossil fuel industry is struggling right now. Financially, they're having trouble getting loans. And so this week, they're contacting their senators, they're contacting the White House, asking for assistance for the fossil fuel company. I have no sympathy for them. There's oversupply. There are the Saudis and the Russians. All this goes on. This all affects Enbridge and all the massive companies that are telling Michigan they're coming through. I say, let us use the rail, let us use the trucks, let's legislate for subsidies for these devices for getting fuel to the propane. Let's stop subsidizing the mega corporations. And truly, we can use the rail, we can get new storage, we can figure this out. We don't need to depend on the large corporations. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Elise Matz.
Good morning, everybody. It is really a pleasure to be here in Escanaba today. Until recently, I was a resident of the UP, and currently I am a member of Michigan's Utility Consumer Participation Board. I like to joke that it is the most obscure board in the state of Michigan. I worked in government for many years and did not know it existed until I got a call and was asked if I would like to serve. But we, as a 5-member board, and they grant money to groups that represent residential ratepayers in cases before the Michigan Public Service Commission. So as somebody who lived in the UP for a long time, I got to work with a lot of communities, and I came to realize how high energy rates and energy costs, not only electric utility, but other energy costs, were impacting their way of life and making it more difficult to live in the UP. And that, combined with my work on the UCPB, has made me very passionate about educating people in the Upper Peninsula about our monopoly utility system, how it evolved and why it is the way it is, why people can't choose their electric service provider, how decisions are made on their behalf, and specifically about the investor-owned utility UPCO and how it's owned by a London-based private equity firm and how that came to be. I thought it was interesting that recently the Mott Foundation commissioned an analysis of what the Utility Consumer Participation Board had spent over the years. Where had the money gone? Where had the board's priorities lay? Because we have to make decisions about where to spend money in cases all over the state of Michigan, not just in UPCO territory, but representing residential ratepayers who live in consumers' electric territory or DTE territory. And I thought it was really interesting that even though UPCO serves a tiny fraction of utility ratepayers in the state of Michigan, we'd spend a much larger proportion of that as the UCPB vigorously representing folks in these cases. And I don't think anybody regrets that. I think everybody thinks that it was a good thing that UPCO's customers were well represented, and certainly they needed that assistance. But I do think that it points to an issue with having a for-profit utility owned by a London-based private equity firm, representing such a small customer base in a rural area. So I hope that as the task force moves into the next phase after today, and best of luck with settling the propane issue, that they take the time to really listen to the experiences of utility ratepayers in the Upper Peninsula, and make recommendations that will not only give them rate relief, but a greater say in their energy future. And in that regard, I've been partnering with We the People, and to go into communities, to talk to people about the utility system, and to gather stories from folks. And so we went to the Sioux Tribe in Escanaba. We went to Escanaba Township. Some of those folks are represented here today, as well as Germfast. And we're going to be sharing those stories and doing more of that work. And we hope that you'll listen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And next, we have Mr. Calvin Hartwig from We the People.
Bonjour, Kinagoya. Calvin Hartwig. Inagada in Mudge, Kaka McQuinn, and Inando. Make which Bizinamuk, Hannaville, Bodowadamuk. Greetings, everyone. My name is Calvin Hartwig. I'm a member of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. I come from Sault Ste. Marie, and I work for We the People Michigan as the Environment and Energy Issues Organizer. As Elise said, we are going across the UP, conducting interviews and listening sessions in communities to get a better sense of their energy needs. So Germfast asked me to represent them. No one was able to come here. And certainly one individual has said that his UPCO electricity bills are so high he can't often afford gasoline. So, if I may, some folks in Germfast felt that Lansing often doesn't hear their concerns, and even went as far as to say perhaps the Upper Peninsula should be the 51st state. And in part because people here in Germfast know what we need, and they felt that Wisconsin paid more attention to their needs than Lansing. The UP needs its own energy system, as well as needs its own energy policy. There are other issues besides energy policy, such as hunting helps us survive, and some folks from downstate don't understand that. The folks in Germfast are in UPCO territory, and many pay really, really high rates. One individual pays over $800 a month. Doesn't pay that, that's what they're billed, but only pays $500 a month because he cannot afford more. His electricity isn't turned off because he's fortunate enough to need it regarding medications in the refrigerator, but not everyone is so lucky. Let's see, his house was heated with electricity. It's not set up for gas or anything else. 4 homes that are heated by electric, EPCO charges them the same rate, almost the full rate. And what I remember is that they expressed, if your house is heated by electric, of course you're going to be consuming more, you should be paying a lower rate. Another anecdote, a pole barn back in 1998 only had for the light bill $4 a month. Now it's $50, over $50. So the big one is cheaper bills. We want to be able to afford the utilities. Regarding UPCO, they do not deduct past payments from current bills, which they should do. There's concern that if there's a change, such as putting in solar panels on an individual home basis, that rates could go up. There was a gentleman there who owned an adult foster care business, and his home was also heated by electric, and he felt that that was the safest way to go, much safer than propane and wood, and et cetera. And he pays $1,000 a month. And it was suggested that businesses that help people, such as AFCs, which are really well needed in the Upper Peninsula, should get credits or lower rates, or both.
Your 3 minutes expired about a minute ago. I've given you latitude because not everyone used their 3 minutes.
Thank you. And the town of Jimfask asked me to represent them. There were 6 particularly vocal individuals representing.
We've heard from the residents of Jimfask at one of our meetings on the east end of the UP. So we have a limited amount of time, and I see you've got another full sheet or two there, and I don't believe we're going to be able to get to those. You could also summarize your comments and submit them to the task force via email, and they will go in the public record, but we have run out of time, and we are already extended beyond your 3-minute limit.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening, and may I kindly propose that the task force considers if an individual is asked by a community to represent several people, to perhaps have more time allocated to that person. Thank you so much.
Welcome. That concludes all of our public comments. Madam Chair, if you would like to call the recess.
Madam Chair has stepped out, so this is James Cliff. So yeah, we will take our lunch recess at this point. We'll reconvene at 1 o'clock. At that point, maybe we'll take a few questions for Eric and Jill, but we do want to get to our recommendations today. So if maybe to begin with, we focus those on ones that might impact the recommendations, draft recommendations we have before us. And once we get through those, maybe we can have some additional questions after that. But unless there is any other comments up there.
No, we've concluded public comment.
All right, so let's recess until 1 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
On their way.
On their way in, we just finished up lunch, and but I think we can get going on the questions for Eric and Jill, and then if members that are joining us in a tardy fashion have more questions, they can jump in.
All right. So Douglas, did you have something you want to kick us off?
Sure. This line of questions is really about timelines. In the event of a disruption in one of the scenarios, these alternatives that you costed out are not necessarily instantaneous. And I think we should all understand the timelines for switching to these options. So I guess my first question really is, to the extent that you're asking for construction of incremental storage in one of these scenarios, how long does that take to come into use?
I mean, I'm gonna jump in here. This is James. We try to make it clear. One point in the report is that we don't decide any of this. The market does. So we'd just be guessing to the extent that we try to put a time frame on things. So there's only so far the report's going to be able to get in the details.
Except that I'm thinking, as we get to the recommendations, that if there are substantial risks to health and safety due to a disruption, and there are investments that might be made in anticipation so as to shorten these timelines, we ought to understand that, and maybe we make a recommendation on it. And that could be in the form of public ownership, subsidy, command, whatever, but, you know, that's why I'm going this direction.
Well, again, and I think, obviously, we have a number of proposed recommendations in the area of storage. That I think is a very important one. Obviously, this is one that is going to take more kind of digging into it to put timelines on that stuff. So I think you're right. I think we can get there. But that's a good point. So go ahead.
Yeah, so in the purpose of this, we didn't assume a specific sort of date of service for the incremental physical infrastructure investment. Obviously, in a trucking scenario, it's likely you can procure a truck with relative ease, and you know that can be in use. But the two major capital costs we assumed around any of these transportations were the incremental storage addition, and that's at the above ground storage tank level, and the transloading capacity. So while I don't have a specific date in this report, I can follow up to look to find one. But we're assuming that's achievable in this first year time horizon. So that's why those costs are incorporated, and you're able to deploy that. The hedge to that not being available sort of at day one is that you have existing storage volumes across every location we modeled. And so we're saying for you to achieve this sustainably throughout time, you add this level of incremental storage during this sort of year period analyzed. But
And I don't think we've said it yet, but I thought about the same question, which is your short term, if you hadn't done anything, of course, would be to bring in a line of rail cars full of propane and identifying a place that those could be parked, you know, and offloaded would be important to try to figure out how you would deal with a short term, you know, acute shortage.
yeah, and we have the pricing data available to say if you did want that option that said it's not incremental storage over the time period, but if you just needed to store the rail car, we have some quotes that we were given on that. But in configuring this, we looked at sort of the apples-to-apples comparison of incremental storage.
So the other aspect of this that I think you have the information to do, but haven't presented in the report is how long do we have, right? If there is a disruption of line 5 or line 1 or the extreme weather scenario, at any particular time of year, it obviously depends on that. You have some in customer storage, you have some in retailer storage. You know, how long before you're in trouble? And then we need to think about how that goes up against how fast something can be done.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that is a good point to make. We don't explicitly say sort of the number of days of supply, because the problem with sort of picking a number there is it varies seasonally, and it varies from year to year. So in years where you've got low stocks coming into a heating season, you've got a shorter term for supply. But we could look at that, and we could add that sort of piece in as looking at the most recent year, looking at a 5-year average as we presented elsewhere. Here are the days of supply available in the state. That number would be based on the all-in storage, and so it's going to have similar challenges as far as whether those barrels are, one, contracted for and deliverable to different customers who are actually in need, or two, whether it's deliverable from the storage point where 90% of the state storage is in the lower, like, quarter of the state, and the needs would be,
Yeah, but our cast in the upper peninsula, I think you could do the flows and stocks.
Yeah, we got some of that in the narrative part of the recommendation, but I think we could add a chart that fully flushed out.
Really helpful.
Well, we could flush that out a little bit more. Yeah, I think we could do that in the narrative part of our recommendation document.
And we can support that and supply that.
All right.
If all retail and end-use tanks are filled at the beginning of December, you have 90 days of supply.
Yeah.
You know, and in the normal
Yeah.
Reorder,
Right.
fill it up, drain it down, you would expect the storage in a customer tank, the average customer, to be about half of the difference between full and reorder point.
Mm-hmm.
And you can assess from that. For those customers that are near the reorder point are going to be the first then to run out, and so you need to be able to replenish them from the supply chain storage, it can be worked through. It's analytically possible.
Yeah, I mean, we've done some of it. You look in the UP, and I think it's one of these things where if you look at the difference between 50% and 80% full tanks, that's about $2.5 million gallons worth of storage in the Upper Peninsula, which is greater than all of the existing. So that's a big number, and that's why that ties into one of those recommendations.
And all of these are,
In a half a month.
yeah, all of these are susceptible in various ways and at various costs to policy. So I think we should be, in terms of our charge of looking at security and affordability of propane supply, this is sort of the crucial analysis in my mind, is if there is an unplanned disruption, how do we cope? And should we do anything in advance?
Yeah. Was that it?
Yeah.
Mike, questions from up there?
This is Jen. I echo what Douglas was saying about understanding that high-level picture of the number of days of supply and the possibility, the options of storage, which we have talked about at almost every meeting. And so I think and I was really looking forward to understanding what those numbers would look like. And so and to that end, the other thing that I feel like we've talked about is, I was talking about this with Michael Larson, the question of understanding the cost of a rail spur. And I'm disappointed that we don't have that number. And that's, Michael's sitting right here.
So this is Michael. I guess one of my questions was, I do think that it would be beneficial to see, thinking about this in a number of scenarios, I thought that we've been discussing over the course of our last several meetings, kind of the short-term, mid-term, long-term, and I think there would be benefit to seeing some of those at least mentioned or borne out somewhat on long-term options, that would include, extending rail from Escanaba to Rapid River, or another storage facility, at a rail terminus, somewhere there. Especially if one of the assumptions is that Line 5 is no longer available. So thinking on a longer-term scale, I think there would be some benefit in at least exploring that. And maybe I understand that this, short-term is the most likely scenario, and planning and those pieces would be up to market, but having some understanding in long-term comparisons would be beneficial, I think.
Eric, did you guys reach out to MDOT to see if maybe they have a per mile construction cost?
So that would be something we could talk to MDOT about.
And then just do the miles of the spur.
Just in case you haven't heard it, we'll do a little outreach to MDOT. And again, since we get into these questions in the recommendation section on that supply question, we'll fill in the narrative a little bit there with any facts and figures we get on that one.
Yeah, so I think that's the one I've heard most wanted to see expressed, is the rail to Rapid River option over the long run. As far as other points in the state where you would reconfigure storage, obviously those options are unlimited to you. So the reason we selected the delivery points we did was the immediate availability of storage. So to help with those short term, you don't need additional capacity. And in the long run, the scenarios, all the costs for rail and trucking all have the additional cost for the transloading equipment necessary for those facilities, but also incremental storage. So if you wanted to pick places on a map to say, how would this look, you could do that and build out the variable cost. But I think we've identified what we think are the best supply options for, simplified analysis, regional distribution across the state, and some diversity.
This is Douglas. I have no quarrel with that as an analytical framing. I would point out that we had extensive discussion about market power and whether we should consider creating competitive alternatives to Plains, Rapid River, if we were doing anything in the way of a state program or subsidy. And so I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the option of doing it on another place as opposed to reinforcing Rapid River.
Yeah, I mean, the narrative on the recommendation side does talk about the fact that, you know, with the sale of the Kinchlow facility, we do have 2 wholesalers now in the UP of a market of 300,000 people. You know, what's the chances of a third wholesaler coming into a market of that size? You know, we have to decide where we kind of do the cutoff on what's possible and where should, to the extent that the state was going to put in incentive dollars, you know, where would they go? A lot of our recommendations, of course, ask the legislature or others to delve in deeper on where would state incentives be the most helpful. But I think these are all good points, but I think they would be flushed out in some of the discussions we have set forth in some of the recommendations before the task force today.
So, and one point from our research was that even though Plains is the dominant provider on the production side at sort of Superior, Sarnia, and Rapid River, they also handle and are shippers for propane via rail out of Edmonton because they're really the dominant, along with NGL Supply Co., who owns the other piece. There's really 2 big players in the industry. So even if you're purchasing rail shipments out of Edmonton, it's still likely a Plains midstream product.
Transaction.
Well, the good news is a lot of this discussion crosses over into the recommendations, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of what you're hitting on, we need to make sure that is reflected in the recommendations document or we sharpen it.
Other questions up north?
Yeah, we have one from Aaron Johnson here.
Yeah, Aaron from MDOT. So I just wanted to reach out. Eric, you and I have corresponded on a few of your questions you had regarding MDOT and also some rail questions. But what you were just talking about, looking at a cost per mile, if you want, you can feel free to put that in an email to me, and I will work with our division of rail and also with, say, contacts at CN Railwood. But, we have some experience in recent years of putting new tracks in. When Eagle Mine came in, we took what was an old rail bed and was a recreational trail near Humboldt and put in rail because of the need. And it happened pretty quickly, but of course the rail bed was there, so that's one easy scenario. But the other one, of course, is putting in new railroad where no old railroad exists. Can be answered, but it's obviously an enormous thing with properties, right-of-way, environmental impacts, all that stuff. So, but I can chase that down if you want to get it through me.
Yeah.
Well, also note, one of the things we heard at one of the meetings was, if you're looking at Rapid River, you would compare that with the cost of just unloading rail at the rail line and having a pipeline go to the storage at Rapid River. Would you build a rail or would you just build a propane pipeline to fill up your tanks that are there? And those are, some of the numbers we might be able to crunch a little.
Right. Okay.
And I think that's, yeah. So Aaron, I will definitely reach out. Thank you. I know, thanks for your help throughout the process. We will see, and I think the cost conclusion we can come to here is if that incremental cost of the rail spread across the volume we're looking at extends the other sort of option too much, then it's probably non-viable. So we'll see if warrants conclusion, but also the timeline I think will be important. So we'll do that. All right. Anything else for PSC?
When you're looking at the whole list, that big long set of options that you modeled, can you say, there seems like there's 2 things to say. One is the spot price at Rapid River came down remarkably in the last couple of years. Is that fair to say?
Yes. I would say the spot market in Rapid River reflects the overall continent-wide decrease in propane prices in 2019 compared to sort of a higher period in the 2017-2018 period. Prices are generally stable within and the wholesale range on the continent in the last 5 years, but there are, 2019 is in the particularly low end of that range. That's true across every provider at this point, and that is only going down right now as you have global oil price, I guess.
And with the leveraging of the fracking companies and the potential for disruption at the fracking company end that potentially might be in front of us in 6 to 12 months, how does that impact
the only thing I'll say to that is if the global oil prices continue to stay extremely low, it edges out the marginal production from shale producers in regions similar to Utica Marcellus, which could impact their long-term decisions for future exploration or current extraction. So that's saying not much, but that's all I can.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these factors, it's not really a disruption issue. It's what might happen to propane prices, period. And as we get into a little bit into assistance programs and into our broader discussion in part 2, we might be able to delve into those a little deeper.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, so if we don't have any more immediate questions, Roman's got his hand up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I actually have a meta question. So what's the best way to convey comments and/or questions? Because I have a list, and this list is only growing, and it's both. Well, I mean, it's predominantly on the report.
I'm happy to
go ahead and send them to me, Roman. This is James, and I will kind of make sure they get in Eric and Jill's and others' hands, and make sure that you get feedback as quickly as we can.
Yeah, it probably makes sense to consolidate so we can eliminate overlap.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we're gonna turn to the recommendations, if that's okay with everybody. All right, I don't see anybody having glaring concerns with that. All right, so you should have in front of you a draft of the task force committee recommendations. So just as a reminder, we're talking about the part 1. Oh, I'm sorry, Eric and Jill. Thank you.
Oh, thank
You said that earlier. Really appreciate it. Thank you. They're excited to get off the hot seat. We'll bring you back to the hot seat soon. So the first thing I wanted to just discuss at the outset is we wanted to add. Let me just say first of all, this is draft. We did receive feedback over the course of the week. We're expecting changes after the conversation today. And then what we'd like to do is consolidate those changes and get this posted to the website and open public comment next week. I will beg for forgiveness given the a little unusual state of affairs right now. So that's the intended timeline. Please understand that, we'll be dealing with, staffing issues and that sort of thing over the next couple of days. So that's the intended timeline. So what we'd like to do is talk through this recommendations document and get your feedback. Again, have received feedback already, but kind of want to make sure that what's here represents what you have actually said. We think it represents what we've heard. So we want to run through that. So at the outset, one of the things I wanted to make sure I emphasize too, I would like to add to the first page, well, it's not technically the first page, the page that is the overview after the table of contents that talks about the charge in front of us. I wanted to add a clarifying sentence that talks about this part 1 being focused on the short-term steps that the state takes in relationship to disruption. Are you guys having trouble hearing me?
No.
Nope. Okay. Great. So I want to add a clarifying sentence that talks about the part 1 of the report being around a propane disruption challenge, and part 2 of the report having a broader lens across the Upper Peninsula to think about energy needs in a long-term way, and then expanding the definition from propane. So wanted to put that on the table. Hopefully that's just a clarifying piece that folks are comfortable with. What you've got in front of you then is a draft letter from me that describes what our activities were at a very high level, a draft of the task force members, or the list of the task force members, and then we get into section 1, which takes us right into recommendations.
Let me just interject that one of the appendix will be a list of all the presentations we heard. We will also have a list of how many people gave public comment, how many different other public comments have we received via email, so all that will also be included in the appendix.
So it probably makes sense to go through this sort of page by page and just get feedback. I think the first couple of pages are analysis and consumption of what we heard and sort of setting the stage based on Dr. Winkler's presentation and the energy demography. And then, of course, we heard regularly how the state energy assessment fits into all of this and make sure we're thinking about the propane recommendations that came out of the Michigan Public Service Commission. and then just sort of setting the table with the facts of the matter in front of us in terms of percentage of households, et cetera. So I guess I'm going to stop talking for a second and just see if there are questions of the overall approach of the report and the first couple of pages of section 1. And then I think where I'm hoping we can focus is stepping through the recommendations, and so that we can talk as a group about places where you feel like what we've drafted at this point doesn't represent what you heard.
Yeah, we have a
Any
question
concerns?
here.
Yep.
Page numbers would be very handy for reference purposes.
Yeah, sorry about that.
As an overall, are we just start here at section 1?
Give her hell.
Okay, I noticed some discrepancy. Fourth paragraph down says 22.8 million gallons used in the UP. 4 pages later, it says 34 million gallons, 78% is residential, which is 62.5 million gallons, or 26.5 million gallons. So there's just, different
Consistency.
data sources or whatever. Just, we should try and keep it consistent.
Yep, I appreciate that, Mike. Good point.
Again, there were different sources, but we'll make sure they're consistent.
Yep, great point.
The second page, it talks about 7 utility companies. I believe there's 19 utility companies in UP.
That's my number.
Yep, okay.
All right.
Even better to have first-hand knowledge. Sorry, what is that, Tanya?
It looks like the munis are
Did I hear
missing.
some?
Is what?
Sorry, Jen.
The 7 doesn't include the munis. I believe there's 12 munis. 12 munis, 4 IOUs, and 3 co-ops is the numbers I use.
Well, that's a really great flag, and also demonstrates the challenge of doing this in the backwards order. I would have preferred to do part 2 before we did part 1. So this is great. Thank you so much. Sorry, I gotta step out.
Yep, good. Other thoughts about section 1?
The bottom of page 2, there's a typo. That last paragraph halfway through, it says more than 9,700 Michigan farmers us propane. I guess it should be used propane.
Yep. Yeah.
I will appreciate the fact that this is all in one place and what represents of the work that's been done. So I'll throw it really is important that we finally have this all in one place, and I do appreciate that.
Yeah, you'll see from our table of contents, we had a section on, highlights from the technical report. But since we got that recently, that is a document that, again, based on some of the comments we heard today, we'll start to kind of pull that document together, and we'll run it by task force members. Jumping to section 2.
I appreciate in the third paragraph in that discussion of our current dependence on Canadian products versus what would seem to be the closer and perhaps even therefore less expensive potential source. Is that that seemed like a high level question that we actually haven't. I didn't see the Canadian dependence as highlighted as much as the fact that there was this alternative, and I feel like we might want to highlight the Canadian dependence instead.
There is some information that we just received in the technical report on this issue that talks about, the infrastructure connection between Marcellus and Michigan. So we might be able to kind of flush that out a little bit more fully, either here or in the highlights of the technical report to make that clearer. That obviously they have large quantities of natural gas liquids and propane in Marcellus. They have chosen not to use existing infrastructure or build new infrastructure to Michigan yet, but we would expect that would change in the case of, disruptions of Canadian supplies. And again, I think it goes back to the other question that's already been highlighted, is the fact that at the moment, higher prices on the international market are kind of drawing propane to the coast to try to access those markets. And unless that changes, we expect to see a little less emphasis on building, infrastructure into the middle of the country that duplicates other infrastructure. But we can talk about that a little bit more. So should we jump to storage, getting into our first recommendations here? I know I appreciated kind of the newer information on, at commercial and resident storage and how that could be an important part of it. Again, got some new information in the technical report, so hopefully that will allow us to flush this out a little bit more. But Douglas has a comment.
Are people hearing me okay in
Yes.
Escanaba?
Yes.
I think they reattached they were supposed to reattach the clocks before we had lunch.
Good. Okay. So recommendation 1, I'm happy with it as it is in terms of trying to maximize the fill status, if you will,
right.
At the beginning of the season. There's another concept that I want us to consider including, and that is essentially the reorder point of the level at which refilling occurs as you go through the season. So if the customer basically runs it down to empty and then refills, if that were the normal behavior, there would be great risk of, in the event of a supply disruption, of some customers running out. Where if they reorder, at a partial tank, then in the event of a supply disruption, they're sort of guaranteed to have some in the tank and can go, some period of time before they hit bottom. The higher that reorder point, basically the more you have in storage and the longer each individual customer has before they run out. But of course that means more frequent trips. That is to me a distinct recommendation from filling at the beginning of the season, but something that we should consider incenting as well.
I see. Can I broaden it a little bit? I mean, I think, and I forget exactly where I've read things now, so some of it might be in the technical report that I believe, and Chris might be able to help us on this, over half the customers are on a plan where the retailer decides when to refill the tank. They've pre-bought. So this is not in the control of the customer, but in control of the retailer. So I think if you kind of made number 1 broad enough, you would impact both how many do they fill early and how full do they keep them through that at least early to mid part of the heating season. So maybe we could broaden it out to kind of include that concept that goes beyond just the start date and might go part way through the heating season at least.
Yeah. And then a related point, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but when we get to the assistance programs, the same idea hasn't been captured, which is we want the assistance programs to enable people to refill before they're empty. So right now, they would be expected to basically run it to empty before they could be in an emergency. We would like them to be able to reorder earlier in order to reduce the risks, both to them individually and to the whole system.
Yeah, we'll get to that later. I mean, we make a reference to the definition of crisis, which is below 25%, potentially modifying that, but with an emphasis on trying to get them on budget plans where, again, that determination of when to refill then goes to the retailer. Chris, I don't know if you've got anything to add here.
Well, the only thing that I would add is generally, as we're making deliveries, we want to make an optimum delivery. So the smaller the delivery becomes to every customer, there's obviously more cost involved in that. So I'm not really sure if that would work or not.
Yeah, and that's where I think in a lot of these, we think it is going to take somebody digging a little deeper, and in case of creating some sort of incentive program, it would take legislation, I believe. Therefore, that would be the forum which kind of a deeper discussion would occur
Well, I suppose
about the trade-offs.
Well, I guess what I was answering to would be like a standard customer, not an assistance customer. But yeah, I do think like a customer that is getting assistance from the state should be able to reorder before they are out, completely out.
Yeah, Chris, this is Douglas. The point I'm trying to make is your optimal refilling behavior doesn't directly account for the greater risks that customers in the whole system have, if we have lower storage amounts in the customer tanks. So we could, as a matter of public policy, work on incentives for you to refill more often or use larger tanks so as to have a higher amount in customer storage at any given time. I understand you have to make a business judgment based on the economics as they are in front of you. We have the opportunity to recommend that there be some steps taken to change that and encourage more storage.
Which gets into number two, too. So I think, again, obviously extending number one. Number two gets into their overall storage, and I think of that as either at the site or in their customers' tanks. In theory, it could be looked at broadly in that way. But again, this is just what I heard, and therefore we're looking to see whether or not there's consensus on the task force for kind of moving ahead with what we have here. And again, we can wordsmith this either today or as we go here. We just want to make sure that we get any kind of glaring things out of here. But it sounds like you might have some language suggestions that broaden these both a little bit and are a little bit more all-encompassing of how the legislature might consider these if they were to create an incentive program.
Eric?
Yeah, we certainly could be less prescriptive than more, right? Because, that would be one way to go. We can go either way.
Yeah, this is Dave Camps up in Escanaba. Recommendation one seems like it's more of a short-term solution with the tanks. I don't know if you can, how that would work in the long term. You got to anticipate disruptions and stuff where you got to permanently affix a greater fill on the tank throughout the year. Where recommendation two seems to be a little bit more long-term, and recommendation three is definitely a long-term solution. That may be a way to consider these as a short-term solution, number one, if we can do something there, and then go into recommendation two for the wholesalers and retailers. That's going to take a little more effort to get storage on the retailers and the wholesaler site. And then number three is going to take quite a bit of effort to get that in place. So that's the way I looked at them, and I got to tell you, I liked all three of these, the way these were, and this recommendation 1 through 3 I thought was pretty good. Thank you.
Okay, that's helpful. So as we're driving towards, attempting for consensus on these recommendations, maybe the other way to think about it is, there certainly could be some more wordsmithing here. Are there concerns with 1, 2, and 3? Does anyone feel like they're not comfortable with these 3 recommendations?
This is Douglas. I have a question about recommendation 3. And it's sort of, what do you think it means? It could be that DTMB has a contract for supply.
Yep.
But that supply is just being delivered, as needed, and therefore creates no buffer. It just avoids price concerns, right? Or it could be that there is a requirement to have some storage here, and those are 2 different propositions in terms of the resilience of the whole system.
We can clarify that. When I use the word, a strategic propane reserve, I was getting into the concept that it may actually contract for some UP storage. Because right now the contract is very much just a price contract. It's actually one company charge the state to fill state tanks that are serving state facilities. This would they potentially change that contract to say, who will hold a little bit of storage in reserve for us in the Upper Peninsula, that it could then kind of dictate where that went or who could fill up off of it. So we can flush that one out a little bit more to make that a little clearer.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts on 1, 2, and 3?
Yeah, Mike Formansky here. All these ideas we're talking about of, additional storage or more frequent fill-ups, to me, they all add cost. It's all insurance policies. That stuff Dr. Rochelle Winkler talked about, all the low-income people in the UP, it just, I'm not proposing I have an answer, but it just seems if there's a lot of, poor people in the UP and we're adding cost to them, I'm not sure we're helping them.
No, again, I think that's one of the things the legislature would carefully have to balance. I mean, I think Chris's point is well taken. Everything now is designed to keep propane at the lowest cost possible. It may change the risk factor of a disruption and what the impact of a disruption would be, but really the system is currently optimized to try to keep the price as low as possible. So, the idea would be is if you add outside state incentives, where would that money be coming from and how it would be divvied out? Would it raise the cost, or is this, in theory, state general fund being used to basically provide a little greater resilience for the Upper Peninsula?
What if we add a sentence to this effect, or maybe a paragraph to this effect, that, we acknowledge that, based on kind of the outset of the report, we're definitely considering the challenges to low-income residents of the Upper Peninsula, and as we think about some of the recommendations here that could be insurance policies to protect from a supply disruption, they can also have the unintended consequence of impacting prices. And so while we are making these recommendations, we don't intend for any to be peeled out and dealt with, completely on its own. It needs to be considered in the overall energy supply challenges. Would something like that make sense to folks?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. Any other thoughts on 1, 2, 3? Okay. Feel free to reach out over the next little bit if you have them. Otherwise, we're going to say that there's consensus there. So let me just pause for a second. Does everyone feel comfortable with consensus on recommendations 1, 2, and 3?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Let's move on to supply infrastructure. Recommendation 4 and 5. James, do you want to set it up? You were doing so well. I don't mean to
No, again, so some of this is just summarizing many of the presentations we heard about, how supply currently operates, how it has changed a little bit recently with the sale of the Kinchlow facility, how we've heard, at least anecdotally, that there's a couple of retailers that have the ability to offtake from rail, beyond the Kinchlow wholesalers' ability to offtake from rail. We get in a little bit about the use numbers, how that could be impacted by weather. A paragraph talking about the Cochin pipeline and what happened in central Wisconsin when they basically lost availability of a propane pipeline and how they dealt with it there, which was basically increased reliance on rail infrastructure. Talked a little bit about the current program that's out there that the state does cover half the cost of somebody putting in kind of a rail offloading facility. Our understanding is that this has been used once recently in the northern lower peninsula, has been its recent use in this area. Talking a little bit about how, which is kind of played out in the technical report, which says that basically, when you get into a disruption situation, if you were to try to rely wholly on rail and trucks, that would in itself, present some risks as you limit your number of ways propane would be coming into the state. And basically with a thought that, hey, to the extent that rail into the UP is seen as any sort of a bottleneck, and that increasing the availability of kind of rail infrastructure for purposes of propane delivery into the UP makes sense, that the legislature or the Michigan Department of Transportation should kind of look at those topics. Thoughts about what's missing or concern with what's there?
Second paragraph.
Go ahead, Mike.
The second paragraph says NGL announced its intention to invest $1 million to upgrade the facility. What upgrades are they doing? Storage or what?
That was from a news account, or it may even been their press release. I guess we should note the source there, but it did not give any further detail.
Okay.
Douglas?
Just on the rail extension recommendations, going back to our earlier discussion where storage, at least in the case of a disruption, might be rail cars, we need an assessment of whether places exist for that. And it may be that, you know, the most useful investment is increasing the siding rather than, you know, an extension of the line or something like that. So just,
You're saying literally for the cars to rest?
Yes.
Like, as Chris takes them off and keeps them at his facility?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
And is there enough of that already? And maybe we could roll that into recommendation number 5 as they explore kind of, you know, because I'd heard at least one anecdotal thing that there used to be more Class 1 railways in the UP that since been downgraded. The question would then be here is, hey, when you look at our Class 1 railways, how much side track is currently available that might be purposed for this reason?
yes.
Maybe we'll roll it into recommendation number 5 there.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
You have to keep in mind that the company, with rail cars, that's basically like a virtual pipeline. You can't take a dozen or 2 dozen and let them sit stationary for weeks. You get 48 hours to unload one, and then the owner of that car needs that back so it can continuously keep making a circle. And if you have 12 cars sitting on a rail siding, every car that is spotted, there's an additional $250 charge from CN to spot each car. So you can't take 12 or 20 cars and just stack them up and let them set. They have to be in rateably and out rateably, and they have to keep making a loop.
So Chris, when they stay at your facility, how long do you keep them on average?
2 days,
Oh, 2 days?
48 hours.
Yeah, that's the maximum, 48 hours, but if that car shows up at 4 in the morning, I'll turn it and release it at 4 in the afternoon so it can get back on track.
Okay.
So I think Eric said that he's got some of the numbers on the cost for parking cars, and we'll fill out the narrative in this section a little bit more and explore kind of what is the cost proposition that we're looking at there. But we'll recognize that this isn't just an unlimited freebie that somebody gets parking their rail cars there.
Sure. And if I may follow up, Chris, this is Douglas again. I'm talking about emergency conditions, not normal operation. And I would say in emergency conditions, we could figure out how to do that.
Yeah,
Right.
you pay the whatever cost is.
Right.
Yeah. As a short term, again, putting that into the short term measure, clearly not a long term solution.
Yeah, I think you would have to do the math on what did a car hold 30,000 gallons, a rail car?
Yeah, roughly.
And if you're gonna hold it for a $250 a day charge for 10 days, how much are you adding to the cost of a gallon, even if it's an emergency situation?
Other thoughts?
The recommendation 5, it talks about MDOT reviewing the ratings of the rail. I thought at one Marquette meeting, they said like CN derated their own rail line, so do you guys rate rail, or is that up to the?
No, I believe that the CN, yeah.
Yeah, I just had them reviewing it. You know, they've got the maps of all the ones that are Class 1 rail or whatever. Yeah, they don't, yeah. We'll clarify that.
So CN.
Yeah, they would be the ones rating their own rail.
Okay.
You know, we have a good
Right.
inventory of how they're classed, I think, in our Office of Rail, but the owner would rate their rail.
Okay.
My understanding.
I would imagine the federal government has a lot to say about it as well.
I was wondering if it makes sense to add some guiding principles, if you would. Based on the previous discussion, we were might have been James who was talking about basically challenges with building a new railway line and basically building new infrastructure. So does it make sense to maybe add a few words about preferences should be given to the existing infrastructure, sort of selection and decision-making process should account for deployment timelines, so how quickly an alternative solution can be deployed, as well as the flexibility to serve as a short and long-term solution.
We can do that.
Good input on 4 and 5. Other points to make? Hearing none, can I make the question of, do we feel,
Dave
go
has
ahead.
a question here.
Yep.
The paragraph after recommendation 5, potential disruptions, monitoring and looking at potential disruptions. I saw in the full report that there's a delineation of shale reserves and where they come from. And with the dynamics increasing in the oil market right now, I don't know where all this NGL or HGLs are sourced, whether it's shale or deep wellheads. Is there any possibility of disruptions coming from that? And is there anything we should add here that we are looking at those potential, if there is any potential disruptions?
Dave, that's a great question. I'm going to back us up for 1 second before we talk about disruptions, though. I just want to affirmatively ask, are we feeling in consensus on 4 and 5 with the additions that folks made over the last few minutes before we move on to disruptions? So I'm going to say that differently. Does anyone not feel in consensus on 4 and 5?
No, not me, not you.
Looks pretty.
Everybody looking all right up there?
Yep.
Okay, everyone's feeling okay down here. Okay, I'm sorry. Carry on. Disruptions.
So on your point there, the technical report again has provided some added information in that area. Currently, the infrastructure between Marcellus and Michigan is used for ethylene, not propane. It could be repurposed. So at the moment, there's not a kind of a direct tie there, but we could probably, based on the technical reports, flush this narrative portion of this out a little bit more regarding, what are some of those, again, I think one of the important things we wanted to note here and wanted to highlight for people is that the 2013-2014 was a combination of factors, not just one factor that added up to the problem. It was, polar vortex, wet fall, bumper crop of corn, CN strike, about everything, a fractionator going down, about everything.
Of a pipeline.
Yeah, so, but we'll add in maybe some of the potential different things that could kind of be additive to a problem and flush that out a little bit more.
Okay.
Now, granted, into the second recommendation number 6, I'll draw your attention to the other document that was sent to you, which prepared by the Michigan Public Service Commission regarding their very first initial look at how they might go about kind of tracking stuff like this and putting it into a spreadsheet for us. This, we assume, this was again pulled together pretty quickly this week. So this is kind of, think of this as version 1.0. And that we will flush this out further before we would get to a final report. But this is kind of what this recommendation number 6, kind of our intention was, is what would a decision matrix look like And who in state government is supposed to be monitoring all these things and, you know, kind of throwing up the red flag or yellow flag depending on the situation? This recommendation gets into the concept that it would be the Michigan Public Service Commission that would be tasked with this role. Dan, I don't know if you wanted to, Dan, oh, he hasn't
had
rejoined.
to peel off and deal with something else.
Do we have Travis?
We've got Travis and Ethan.
Travis, Ethan, I don't know if you want to kind of add anything else at this point?
No, I think this is Ethan here. I think you framed it up pretty well, James. This was just kind of our first initial go at it. We already have in the energy security section at the PSC, we have energy emergency response and preparedness functions and plans already established, so that maybe perhaps this kind of matrix might just be a supplemental kind of document to existing plans that we already have.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, go ahead, Douglas.
This is Douglas. I would like to hear from you at the commission on whether you think that either the commission or others in state government have sufficient powers in the event of an emergency to do the right follow-up actions, or if that's an area we need to spend more time on in the report.
This is Ethan again. I'm probably going to defer on that one. Maybe Dan, if he gets on later, maybe he'll speak to that a bit more.
This is Trev. I can just weigh in. Just one of the things that we can do for an emergency, if there's an emergency declaration for something like a propane shortage, would be to recommend hours of service waivers, or to allow trucks to be on the road longer, basically to help alleviate the strain. I'm with Ethan. I don't think I have an opinion on whether or not that's sufficient. I think it's really hard to tell. Depending on the circumstance, what measures would need to be taken, and if that would be sufficient, or if there would need to be more.
Thank you.
Other thoughts or questions on this recommendation number 6?
This is Roman. I forgot to unmute myself. The more I think about recommendation 6, the more I like it. I think it is a very necessary and overly an often overlooked measure, an early risk identification, so to speak. If there is this, system, even if it's, just to identify potential risks, estimate their how imminent they are. I think this is a very well thought recommendation. Just kudos to you guys.
Well, thank you, Roman. So I'm going to call the question. Does anyone not feel in consensus on recommendation 6?
Do we want to put any kind of time frame, or who, if it's going to the PSC, just it made me think, when would this happen? It's a high level question too, but when would this information be put together and requiring that annual disclosure? Is that something that the commissioners would just issue an order on and it would be done? Is that what we're thinking?
I think that we could deal with administration of it kind of in the next step. So I don't know that we need to be prescriptive about that in the recommendation.
Okay. Fair.
All good questions though, for sure. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to James again to talk about the messy, complicated assistance program approach.
The caveat being that this is probably where my greatest learning curve occurred, and that's saying something given that, I didn't know that much about propane when this all started. This section outlines, some of the information the task force heard on how assistance programs, the state, currently overlap, especially with propane users, and where kind of implementation of some of those programs provide special challenges to propane users. I think you could argue that some of these recommendations go well beyond propane users when you start to get into things about focus on weatherization and things like that. I expect that the task force might revisit some of those issues in part 2, and therefore these were just kind of very initial, fairly general kind of recommendations that the state could start to look at. But again, I don't think this is going to be the last that we go back and look at this issue maybe a little deeper. Again, so it kind of goes through, kind of separates out the assistance programs from the weatherization programs, and makes a number of recommendations in both areas.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
This is Douglas. The heading, addressing the high cost of energy in the Upper Peninsula, I want to keep, but the discussion under it immediately goes to low income.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if we might not say something about it just in general.
All right.
And then pull particularly recommendation number 10 up underneath that. So that recommendation is about all households or maybe even all propane users. You know, that in general, efficiency is the best investment here, and we should try to create efficiency programs or weatherization programs for those that use propane and aren't therefore eligible to participate in the gas programs. And then I think the rest of the recommendations appropriately do focus on low income. And so we would go to this discussion of low income and assistance programs and carry on with the rest of the recommendations.
This is Tanya Sweenor. I have a comment on the top of the page where it says the home heating credit is available to all low-income households. I would change that to all eligible households, because really it's 110% federal poverty level or below that's eligible, so that's not a true statement.
Got it, Tanya.
Got it.
And then the first bullet, as far as I understand, the limit is $1,200 for SER, but they can only get one assist. But I've seen people get $1,200, get a quote for $1,200 and get a fill up for that much. So I'm not
For
really
the first bullet?
In the first bullet where it says $350 to $700.
Okay.
I would just double check that.
We will. There was some calls out to the agency that weren't returned before this had to go out, and so some of this is pulled off their website, and some other sources of information. So we will double check that.
Tony's got a question here.
This relates to what Douglas was talking about in recommendation number 10, moving it forward. I have some concerns about recommendation number 10, that we're gonna assess the very people that we're trying to help with the low income assistance. And if you look at the Alice households, I'm not sure that putting a special assessment on our propane is the right idea here. So it's not that I'm opposed to that going right down the line to our low income people. Thank you.
So, yeah, definitely something to be discussed for sure. And, you know, we tried to pull out what we thought we heard, but if there's not consensus, you know, obviously that's open for discussion too. So,
This is Douglas. I completely understand the concern. I just want to point out that we have similar arrangements for electric and gas utilities, and they work in the same way. The assessment applies to everyone. And then what becomes important is that you make sure that there's good program delivery for low-income customers, and maybe even, you know, disproportionate spending on them in those efficiency programs. it's really, really difficult to have these kinds of assessments and exempt the right people from paying them. So, that's kind of the counter argument to the concern, but I completely respect the concern. I agree with it.
Any other comments? I guess we'll start with kind of on the narrative, and then we'll walk through kind of the recommendations. We'll do 7 and 8. We'll separate out number 10 and talk about 9, 11, and 12.
So just to the last point that Douglas was commenting on too, I also think not all of these recommendations are taken holistically. It's possible, first of all, it's possible nothing happens. Second of all, it's possible a subset of it happens. So it's a tough thing to build, right? Because you want to, if people want to pluck out a component and think about it, they can do that. There are unintended consequences. So I think we just need to put in here from a recommendations perspective things that we're comfortable with, and then the parameters to do our best to deal with the unintended consequences. So, we will beef up the language about making reference to, we don't want to increase the bills that are being paid by the people that we're trying to help. So anyway, I don't know if that's useful in the context or not, but
if I can add to and try to help you out, Madam Chair. None of these recommendations are going to be enacted exactly the way that each of us are thinking about it independently.
Yep.
If you've been involved in the making of laws downtown, it does not happen the way that the first idea starts out as. So we have to put it together as best as we can and then hope that the outcome is something close to what we envision. That's really what it comes down to.
Well said. So let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but let's make sure that we're capturing as much as we can.
Absolutely.
Okay.
One
Sorry,
comment
just wanted to make
on the
minor
narrative. It is primarily focused statewide, the narrative. There's the pullout about that there are 3 counties that don't have participation in the electric LIHEAP. Then it goes to the 950,000 households are eligible for assistance. Is there a way to pull out the UP from that?
I'd made call to try to see if we have that information. Have not got that yet, so I didn't add anything.
I asked the same question, Jen. We don't know. We'll try to get it.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, good flag. Great minds. Okay, 7 and 8. I'm sorry, James was keeping us on task and I took us off.
7, 8, 10.
7, 8, and...
Well, let's do 7, 8 first, and then we'll walk through. Are people comfortable with recommendation 7 and recommendation number 8?
All right, hearing no concerns, we are comfortable telling DHHS and DTMB to do some work.
You bet.
I feel comfortable with that.
Lisa will make the appropriate calls.
I will.
Right.
Will not happen in the next couple of days. Okay.
Regarding recommendation 8, this is Tanya Sweenor. I just wanted to give you an update. The MPSC and DHHS have formed committees, and one of the committees is called the Provision of Deliverable Fuel in Times of Crisis. So that committee is going to be working on the propane issue. So that would be the state, the MPSC, and the grantees, MEEP grantees working together.
I would hope they're going to use our report, not
Well-
recreate the wheel.
Well, and Tanya
Well, they've already started.
Was it Sault Ste. Marie where Tanya told us they'd already done that? So, yeah, that's a good flag, Tanya. We'll make sure to support the good work that's already ongoing. Okay. Okay, so moving forward, we're 9, 10, 11, 12. So 9 is, hey, legislature, we think this is worth funding. 10 is, legislature should build a work group or something with Propane Gas Association to think about, building their own weatherization program. 11, legislature should consider establishing a fund. again, putting more dollars into.
This gets
support.
into homes that have deferrals, that they need a new roof, and no state or federal weatherization money can be spent on a home because of some other defect. So, been noted in a number of work group settings that this stops work on probably, half the homes out there that people go to visit.
And then finally, MPSC should have a one standard application, so streamlining.
Can I make a comment on
does
that?
anybody want to talk about these in detail before we kind of call the question?
This is Tanya Sweenor again on recommendation 12. They do have one streamlined application. That the SER application is the only application that's done now, and that started last year. So are you referring to something else? Income qualification is done through the department.
Through DHHS. When you
Yes.
think about that one application, do you feel like it covers, what customers need?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a standardized
I think
application
that
that
our recommendations
any
are
grantee
set.
can,
So good.
any grantee can accept any other grantee's application. There's only a few minor differences.
So when it gets in, again, I'm thinking of some of the stuff we got at the presentation. So utilities have a host of programs that they offer, and maybe this is getting a little bit at the wrong issue. The local community action agency is then left to try to figure out how they mesh the state programs with the various utility programs offered in their community. Is that question addressed by this SCR application process?
Not necessarily.
And so maybe I've framed it a little wrong here, is that appears to be the concern that we heard, is that the community action agencies struggle because they're operating under, these people say these people are qualified, these people say these people. So the application into the state is one application, but then the utility programs aren't consistent with how they apply to maybe a state system. So that, I think, was a little bit more of what we heard, mainly at the presentation in the SUE by the representative of the community action agency there. So maybe broaden this out to talk about, maybe to the extent possible, kind of harmonizing, kind of state processes with individual utility, kind of processes and applications, so that we can have a more kind of streamlined, uniform system. And again, I think it's a heavy lift. It's not an easy one by any means, but maybe broadening out kind of what we're talking about here. And it's going on. I think what you're getting into is there only one application into the state? Yes. That gets you into both assistance and weatherization programs. It's more trying to harmonize those with the various utility offerings in a way that maybe makes more sense.
Okay, so you're actually you're actually referencing the affordable payment plans. And that is true that there are 4 utilities that have affordable payment plans, and they are working together in one of these work groups to try to standardize that, but it's dependent on system upgrades. So there are plans to try to have that done within the next 2 grant terms.
And again, maybe this is one where I'll talk to I'm assuming Brian Banks and others, get a little bit more information so that we make sure that we're basically maybe reinforcing some of the current efforts that are already going on in that area.
Okay.
Thanks, Tanya.
I like how you started out, though. The MPSC should require that the state application then be the one that is accepted by the utilities, is more or less all we need to say there. Yeah.
All right, we'll figure it out.
So any other discussion around 9 through 12?
Yes, if I may. So I have 2 comments. Recommendation 10. So there is a levying small surcharge on propane fuel to target a weatherization program focused on residential propane users in Michigan. Does it make sense to specify which sort of the priority of residential propane users in Michigan in that respect?
One thing I thought when you were saying that, do you mean, hey, if you're going to put it on propane, then it should apply to all commercial and residential? If everyone's paying for it, similar utility programs, they carve out those different audiences and try to serve each of them. That's maybe part of what I heard there, but I think you might have been going beyond that, Roman.
Yeah, a bit beyond in terms of the say types of users or types of customers, say low income and whatnot. So if it's a weatherization program, right? So the focus should be on the most vulnerable, right? So, or the priority should be given in disbursements of those funds. The priority should be given to the most vulnerable users. That's what I was also thinking.
What might help here is maybe we can add in a little bit more in the narrative section about how some of the other programs work for the other utilities and the other commodities. And that might give a little bit more background on how these current programs are designed in other areas. And that might help people understand kind of a little bit about what would be on the table here, at least in any discussion with the propane representatives.
Fair enough, fair enough. So my second comment is a bit more controversial. And it is about a potential recommendation that is not here, right? So we've talked about energy efficiency as one of the ways to decrease the demand, right? So and increase energy security, at least for heating services. So another way to increase energy security would be to diversify the fuel mix, both at a customer level and as a mix in general. So that's sort of another way, right? So and I don't know how exactly to formulate this recommendation, whether this recommendation even belongs there, but to illustrate my point, I think Jen told us a story how she, her furnace broke, and she was relying on a wood stove for two weeks. So that would be the Jen recommendation, if you would. So something at least, and I know this is sort of looking forward to the phase 2, but it also relates to the various service that most of the service that propane provides, which is heating, right? So, and again, sort of, and I don't know. I mean, it's that's why it's a sort of a controversial recommendation or suggestion, whatnot, to at least carve out a space for other means such as fuel diversification or something, or fuel switching as potential mechanisms for essentially increasing energy security.
I'd support that.
Potentially in the narrative at the beginning there, so in that addressing the high cost of energy, that could be that first paragraph.
I think that might be actually the best solution.
I mean, the question is, and I'd be interested in, kind of what the recommendation is, because this is clearly an area that is all about part 2 of this report, and something that I expect that we're going to get into in more detail. So we're almost recommending that we look into this in more detail. I'm trying to think, who would we be tasking to do more work in that area prior to us doing part 2 of our report?
I think it might have been Jan who suggested that actually, adding some of this language in the narrative. That might be actually a better solution. And the more I think about it, the more I like this idea, because you're absolutely right. I mean, that would be, telling us to to think about it or to talk about it. Just a reminder, right? So yeah. So I agree with Jen's suggestion.
We'll put something in the narrative.
We'll do that.
Good flag.
This is Michael Larson.
Yes, Michael, please.
I think who we were going to task. I mean, if it was talking about fuel switching, it would be looking at the current rules for in energy optimization and so on, to allow for utilities to use funds for fuel switching. So, I mean, I think it would be an MPSC task to review, the current rules that exist in the programs to, allow electric utilities to promote, electric heating and moving from propane or gas over to heat pumps as a primary or secondary fuel source. So I do think it would be an MPSC task to review the current standards that are out there.
So I think if we set ourselves up, I think our key will be to make the best case possible for it in part two, if that's what we want to do, instead of, because we don't have a lot of the background information that I think would support that yet gathered.
Fair enough.
Dave Camps here.
And
But, I would be careful with the
This is
fuel
Douglas.
switching. Fuel switching with the utility programs is a pretty sensitive topic. You can be seen as.
Yes, it is.
Yes, okay. Just want to make sure
Yeah,
you know that.
and this is Douglas. I just would say that by prior commission decisions and my own interpretation of the law, the commission doesn't have the authority to do that within the energy waste reduction programs. There are potentially other ways, but it really would be a legislative matter. So I think I'm in favor of waiting until the next report and wrestling with this there.
So it sounds like it's good to put some language in the narrative and then hold it to part two.
Yep, that's fair.
Everybody feel good about that?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay, other comments on 9 through 12? Okay, how do we feel about consensus on 9 through 12? Are there concerns? Does anyone feel like 9 through 12 goes anywhere they don't feel comfortable?
Not me.
Chris Bowman, I'd like to agree with Tony's comment on recommendation number 10. I feel the same way he does. That's all.
Is there a way to, do Tony or Chris have suggestions around language to modify 10, or do you just not feel comfortable with 10 at all?
I don't have, this is Tony, I don't have suggestions on how to get around the fact that we're levying, in essence, a tax on the most vulnerable people that are paying our propane prices. That's the concern I share. And some of them are tenants, they're not homeowners. That gets into a little bit of the weatherization as well, but I just have some concerns there. I don't have a suggestion for replacement language. I'm not opposed to leaving it in there, but my big concern is we talked about it earlier, that the legislature gets a piece of language and then everybody wants to put their fingerprints on it, and pretty soon we got a 5-cent increase to the people that we're trying to protect. So that's a big concern for me.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I will, when I think about the program design that we've used in other areas of efficiency, this is just a sentence. It's very high level. But in high level, it is in parallel with the same sort of designs for other programs. So what ends up happening is you do see it's usually not in the neighborhood of the magnitude of a 5 cents. You see it in the magnitude of a component of a penny if you first figure it the percentage of your overall monthly bill. But then what it is of course it's a small number that would be distributed across all folks that are consuming the resource. And so what you end up having is dollars that are able to support the low income or the vulnerable population. But I do hear what you're saying. So. Chris, is that the angle of your concern? And do you feel comfortable with this, or are you uncomfortable with this?
No, that's the same way I feel, so.
Okay. Is there a way to craft some language to add to that, to, say that the structure of a program would need to be such that it does not put additional burden on vulnerable populations?
Yeah, you could say, this is Dave Camps, you could, in the utility programs, they require a minimum payback. If you invest in a home, it has to break even within a year, 6 months, whatever the measure may be. And it actually works out in favor of the customer because they use less less fuel, and it can reduce their costs overall, but you have to have the restrictions into the program that limit the time and the costs.
Okay.
And it is a relatively small portion of the bill. Like even on the electric costs, most people are $1 or less in there. It's 92 cents is the average addition to the monthly bill.
Per month?
Per month.
Michael, per month?
For all rate-regulated utilities,
Okay.
electric utilities.
Where the problem comes in is that not everybody takes advantage of the program. The people that take advantage come out ahead, but so the utility programs always struggle with the penetration of the program.
Yep.
So if a
Okay, I'm gonna just try to keep us moving and call the question. Anyone need to discuss more, or feel out of line with 9 through 12?
I'm just wondering if we're getting a little far out on the branch of what our core mission was, making these sorts of recommendations. It doesn't seem to have a direct correlation to me with, impact on supply, delivery and price on propane. Maybe we'll get there in a second.
This is Douglas. I don't agree that that's our charge. I think we were charged to look at affordability. Using less makes it more affordable.
Yeah, the language is, let me read it for us again. Security, reliability, affordability, and environmental soundness. So I guess I'm not sure. I feel like this fits within our charge, but I guess if others have concerns, we can talk about it.
This is Dave Camps. I agree with it. I think it leverages the second mandate too. I think it's going to work into that. The energy efficiency part of this is synergistic with part 2.
All right, calling the question again, 9 through 12.
I'm good.
Okay. Moving on, since we're quiet. I take your quiet as feeling good.
Silence.
All right, yep. Mike, did you have something?
I just said silence is assent.
Got it. Okay, moving forward, recommendation 13, so state contracting for propane.
This pretty much just highlights the 2 other recommendations that were made in 2 other places that the state should explore whether or not they use their current contracting for propane in a couple of different manners. One, is there any way it can be used to lower the cost of providing assistance? And number 2, could it be used as a kind of a strategic storage reserve? And that just directs them to explore those 2 options.
I'm good with it.
Yeah, do we have any idea how much propane the state contracts for annually for the facilities that use it?
I have a copy of the contract. I don't, off the top of my head, remember what that number is. It's basically a contract that outlines how pricing will be done. So it's not a dollar amount. It just indexes how the pricing is done. I could go back and look to see, what they paid, but basically it's just what they paid to heat or use at state facilities in the past year. It is used for the sole purpose of sourcing state facilities at this time.
Yeah, I'm assuming it's not a huge number, so the amount.
I think it was pretty big.
Yeah, the amount of leverage that we have would be probably minimal.
Yeah, I've been giggling because I think it's actually very big, and so.
Yeah, this is Douglas. I do not know the number. I want to hasten to say that, but if I have looked at that kind of analysis for natural gas, and if that carries over, we're probably looking at somewhere between 3 and 4% of total consumption in the state being used in public buildings, so state and local governments, which is a pretty big number.
We'll try to get a little bit more background for the task force on that topic. I'll follow up.
Thanks.
How are we feeling about recommending the DTMB, see if they can, use that contract to also support additional storage capacity or serving low-income residents? Anyone have concerns?
This is Tanya Sweenor. Would that include all the different propane providers, or would that be just one
Great
provider?
question.
Yeah, so I would think that they currently, and I don't know how they structured their request for proposal. It is currently with one provider statewide. I would guess that if they wanted to kind of adopt some of these recommendations, that they may have to contract differently in the future and not necessarily just go with one provider, but they might end up having to potentially regionalize their approach or have separate contracts serve different purposes. I think this would change the way they currently contract.
And again, in an attempt to avoid unintended consequences here, the recommendation is drafted as should explore. So it's not, A, we don't have any power, B, it's not definitive either. It tries to give them flexibility.
Don't you think that the supplier, the single supplier for DTMB, is actually then regionalizing it themselves? I would think that they are probably then subcontracting to somebody in various regions.
Again, not to get into the question of just, propane purchases by the state, but I don't know what the request for proposal looks like. If they're limiting it to people that can serve the state statewide, that is probably a limited number of companies that fall into that category. And therefore, they have a relatively small number of potential vendors. But again, and I'm not going to question the wisdom of how they do that, if you got into these other areas, I think it would require them to relook at that issue.
But if they did, if that's how it is happening, and they did do that regionally, they may actually get better pricing. They may get worse because it's smaller.
Yeah, unclear. So we'll let them look at it.
Okay.
All right, Liesl did have to step out again. Any thoughts about, any other questions on this recommendation? Any objection to this recommendation being included? Hearing none. This takes us to our last recommendation. This gets into the issue of consumer protection. We heard presentations by the Public Service Commission and the Attorney General's office about how Michigan's current Consumer Protection Act doesn't provide ideal coverage in the case of fuels. The two instances that they pointed out is that it doesn't cover wholesalers, and secondarily, it doesn't work very well, and maybe in the case of a disruption, if many parties were working kind of in concert and they all look the same, then they don't come under the act. The recommendation looks at the Wisconsin model, and that was based on some of the feedback from members. And just to remind folks, the Wisconsin model was pretty limited in that it only covered term in places where the governor had declared an emergency, an energy emergency. And basically what it required is that companies then open their books and just justify the price they're charging. And as long as kind of their higher price is because their higher cost plus a reasonable profit, that's the end of story. No restrictions on it. It was just basically that in times of declared emergencies that you might be subject to some level of oversight that you weren't charging beyond your customary profit on the product you were selling. Any questions? Any thoughts, comments? Any concerns? I'll take that in the affirmative. Therefore, that kind of takes us through the document. Just to recap what we heard earlier, what we'll do is we'll revise this document based on what we've heard today. And I'm assuming that what will happen is early next week, hopefully either Monday or Tuesday, we'll make some of the revisions. Some of the revisions are going to take a little longer. They're going to take a little bit of research, but we're going to just act like those are public comments going in on the revised document. But there were a number of other corrections that we'll make to this document. We'll put it out on the UP Energy Task Force website. We'll open up public comment until April 6th. We'll use all the mechanisms we have to kind of get the word out that it's there. And again, to be clear, we will be taking public comment on the recommendations. The technical report is basically just a report that's been given to the task force, so the public comments aren't necessarily geared toward that report. They may comment on how, or what the takeaways for the task force should be from that report and things like that, but that report itself. Any other questions?
How long do we have task force to make comments on the propane supply alternatives for Michigan?
The appropriate, you mean it's?
The main report, your report.
Oh.
Yeah, it's 115 pages long, and I'm still working on the Mueller report.
Yeah, I understand that. So we'll look at that and determine one of a couple things could happen. We could decide that we could highlight or accentuate certain portions of that report in a supplemental document, or as we do highlights of their report, we could talk a little bit about, what we think should be important takeaways from their report. But feel free, get us those as quickly as you can on that technical report from the task force members, and we'll work with the public sector team to address those.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? I know the director is very appreciative of all the work that the task force members have done. I think your level of commitment is shown by everyone, being in the room again today, even to kind of continue our work here. We really appreciate that. And we'll, again, as we get comments in, we'll batch them, but we won't wait till the very end. We'll probably send them on to task force members in batches, just so you can kind of start to read some of the feedback that we're getting here at the agency. Other closing remarks by any of the other task force members?
This is Douglas. I want to thank you and the rest of the folks for getting this draft this far along. It's good.
Appreciate it.
This is Aaron. Just a clarification, as far as any additional comments you want in ASAP, who specifically should we email those to?
Yeah, those should be to me, James Clift, CLIFTJ @michigan.gov. We'll circulate that email. We'll do a follow-up email here, if not today, on Monday, to give you that address again.
James, Tony, again, I just want to thank PSC. I think they did an outstanding job with the detailed report that they sent us, and their patience, the ability for them to research some of the documents that we've asked for. They're very timely, so I think they did a fine job.
Yeah, I don't think people recognize the challenge of researching an unregulated industry and what that might entail. But I think they did a wonderful job there. With that, I'll leave it to you, Mr. Vice Chair, Mike, to adjourn this meeting.
Well, we've got a couple comments here, Mike. James.
All right.
James, on these comments, would you prefer that the group send it to the whole group? So that if me and 3 other people have the same idea, you don't get it 4 times?
Sure, yeah, include the whole kind of list that we've been using of task force members.
Okay. And then in the comments from this month, there was one of the comments that Kimber sent out was, a guy referenced a meeting of 2 task force members had a meeting in Houghton. I mean, I've turned down media requests because I thought we weren't supposed to do media requests, and I know that's not media requests, it's a presentation, but it's kind of on the same line. Are we supposed to be doing things like that or not?
Not necessarily. I mean, again, they were just, I think, kind of wanted to reach out to their community, and kind of, in my understanding, was to basically inform them of what the task force was up to. And again, just try to make sure that everyone kind of knew what we were up to and were kind of paying attention to what we did. But they weren't necessarily, they made it very clear that they weren't speaking on behalf of the task force, and it wasn't a meeting of the task force. I think it was just kind of a raised public awareness type of event.
Right, and the slides, I made very clear that all the slides that were presented to us by the folks. It was not, aside from a picture of my furnace and my wood stove, everything else was slides from our presentation. It was just another way to get the information to people, and the ask to them was to comment on what they heard and to go seek more information, and was in no way speaking for us at all. It was just a way to get the word out. And I've also spoken to a group up in Big Bay, Powell Township, which is entirely dependent on propane, and which was a really interesting conversation. And they're really grateful. I think what I can communicate is how grateful they are that these questions are being looked at by us.
I just had no, I didn't know we were supposed to do it, had no prior knowledge of it. It was a surprise when I saw it in the notes that it happened.
I could share the presentation as well. It's, if you want to see it. It's
You're gonna have big sales next.
Well, I'll be there.
Chris, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I did. At what point can we put a recommendation in there to quit beating the horse and bore the tunnel? Seems as though with all this information, it's probably the most economical solution. That's all I have to say.
Or could we do that in part 2?
Ask Mike to repeat it.
I think if we're talking.
Yeah, we did.
Go ahead, Jim.
Mike, can you repeat that? We didn't catch it here.
That wasn't Mike.
No, Chris was just wondering about including as part of the report the support for the boring of the tunnel in as expeditious a manner as possible, as perhaps a minority segment or at least a mention within this, because we mentioned both line 1 and line 5 in numerous parts of our work and PSC's work. So I think Chris was just indicating he would like to see something like that in our final report.
So I am going to, in very much danger, try to speak on behalf of that I think Lisa would be uncomfortable in that there is a potential that we will have permits before this agency prior to the final report, and therefore I think she would prefer not to see a recommendation in this report that would be in some way signaling kind of our review of those potential applications.
I guess good enough.
Yeah, I just hope I didn't mischaracterize Chris's initial comment.
Well, no, it just
No, I
seems
think,
as-
I understood where you were going. I mean, I
just
just,
seems as-
flagging the fact that we assume that we will be seeing potential permit applications, and therefore I think we would rather not get into that topic. It will get enough attention as is.
Right, but as far as all the data and information that I've seen, and I'm not speaking for the entire board, we're all individuals that's probably the most economical and affordable solution to all energies in the Upper Peninsula and or the Lower Peninsula.
As the chair of the Tunnel Commission, I totally agree, Chris, but I also understand the reasoning that Eagle probably wants to stay away from it because they do have to review the permit. So there's a little conflict in there with the two situations going on at the same time.
Any more comments from the UP side? If not, I'd just like to add my thanks to all the staff that worked so hard to get all the things we need in front of us every time we get together here, and how much we appreciate that support that they give us every time we're getting together here. But seeing no further comments, I would move to adjourn.
Support.
Or
All in favor, get up and leave.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.